Hi guys, and welcome to Quiet History Vault tonight. You arrive just a little too late. A thin layer of ash drifts slowly through the air, settling softly on your shoulders, light as snow but warmer than it should be. You brush it away without thinking, only to notice how quiet everything is. No footsteps, no distant voices, not even the sound of wind, just a stillness that feels unnatural. You take a slow breath, and there is a faint, bitter taste in the air. It lingers longer than expected. You pause. Because something here does not quite make sense, and the more you notice, the clearer it becomes. If you were truly standing here, you would not have time to understand it. You probably would not survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to share your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights, flow straight into the story. The ash becomes snow before you fully realise the landscape has changed. That strange, grey, drifting powder dissolves into pale flakes moving lazily through cold prairie air, while your boots sink softly into frozen grass beside a long line of wagons. Somewhere nearby, oxen snort steam into the evening light. Canvas covers creak gently. A child coughs once from inside a wagon bed layered with quilts and buffalo robes. And suddenly you're no longer standing in mystery or disaster. You're standing on the Oregon Trail in late autumn, where timing is everything, and winter has arrived with extremely poor manners. The prairie stretches endlessly around you beneath a bruised grey sky. Flat land rolls westward toward distant hills already fading behind curtains of snow. The trail itself appears less like a road, and more like a tired suggestion scratched into earth by thousands of wheels. You walk slowly beside the wagons while the cold air pinches your cheeks awake. Families move carefully through camp, preparing for another freezing night. Someone hangs a kettle over a low fire. Someone else tightens harness straps with stiff red hands. A woman beats frost from a wool blanket while muttering under her breath, in a tone suggesting she did not fully appreciate the brochure for westward migration. Not that there was a brochure, although honestly, if there had been, it probably would have left out certain details, such as dysentery, or axle grease, or the fact that oxen occasionally sit down in mud and simply refuse further participation in civilization. A well-established historical reality of the Oregon Trail is that most emigrant families travelled between spring and early autumn to avoid severe winter conditions in the mountains and plains. Leaving too late in the season could become catastrophic. Snowstorms trapped wagon trains every year, especially farther west near South Pass in the Rockies, and tonight you begin realizing your own wagon train may have waited slightly too long. The wind carries the smell of wood smoke across camp. It mixes with damp canvas, animal sweat, cold earth, and faint traces of bacon grease from somebody's supper. It is not unpleasant exactly, just dense, heavy. The scent of too many humans and too many animals sharing one uncertain patch of prairie. You pass a fire where three men study the darkening horizon. Nobody says the word storm aloud. That alone tells you how worried they are. People on the trail develop strange superstitions about weather. Some emigrants believed unusual sunsets predicted snow. Others watched animal behavior carefully, convinced oxen sensed blizzards before humans did. A lesser-known trail anecdote describes travellers tying strips of cloth to wagon bows to observe subtle wind changes overnight, which honestly feels like 19th century meteorology improvising itself in real time. Historians still debate whether many late-season wagon parties underestimated prairie winters because guidebooks painted overly optimistic pictures of Western travel. Some diaries suggest emigrants fully understood the risks but simply had few alternatives after delays. Illness or broken equipment slowed the journey east of the Rockies. You suspect the truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. Human beings are remarkably talented at believing difficult things will somehow become manageable tomorrow. The first heavier snowflakes begin falling as dusk settles over camp. Children notice them before adults do. A little girl near the supply wagon sticks out her mitten and laughs quietly when flakes gather against the wool. Her younger brother attempts catching snow with his tongue before receiving immediate parental disapproval from 3 separate directions. Even exhausted wagon camps apparently maintain strong opinions regarding frozen precipitation etiquette. You continue walking between wagons. The camp stretches longer than expected. Nearly 40 wagons stand arranged in uneven rows beside a narrow creek already crusted with ice along its edges. Lanterns glow dimly beneath canvas covers. Shadows move slowly behind fabric walls where families organize bedding and cooking supplies for the night. Inside those wagons, entire lives travel westward. Bibles wrapped carefully in cloth. Cast iron pans, sewing kits, coffee grinders, tiny carved toys, letters from relatives back east. One mainstream historical detail often forgotten today is that most Oregon Trail emigrants were ordinary farming families rather than adventurous explorers. They carried practical household belongings because they intended to build permanent homes in Oregon Territory, California, or Utah. The trail was less an expedition and more an enormous migration of civilians, which somehow makes the danger feel quieter, more intimate. You stop beside your assigned wagon while snow thickens gently overhead. The oxen stand nearby with lowered heads, their broad bodies dusted white. Leather harnesses creak softly whenever they shift weight. One animal watches you with enormous patient eyes, suggesting it has already endured several terrible human decisions this month alone. Fair enough. Your wagon driver, a broad-shouldered man named Eli, finishes checking wheel chains before glancing toward the sky. "We may wake buried," he says calmly. You wait for him to smile afterward. He does not. That is not encouraging. You climb into the wagon carefully, ducking beneath stiff canvas. The interior smells of wool blankets, dried herbs, lamp oil, and faint lingering smoke trapped in fabric. Every inch of space matters here. Crates serve as seats. Coats become pillows. A sack of flour supports one corner where bedding threatens collapse. Outside, the wind rises slowly. Not violent yet, just steady enough to rattle the wagon cover in soft, uneven breaths. You settle beneath heavy quilts while listening to camp noises fade one by one across the snow-covered prairie. Fires crackle lower, conversations soften. Somewhere distant. A fiddle plays briefly before stopping mid-tune as though the musician suddenly remembered how cold his fingers were, and beneath it all comes the constant whisper of falling snow. Slow, persistent, patient. The kind of snowfall that does not need drama because it fully intends staying a while. You close your eyes while the wagon rocks gently in the wind. Tomorrow, the trail ahead may disappear completely, but tonight, the storm is only introducing itself. The wagon creaks softly around you through the night. At first the sound blends into sleep so naturally that you barely notice it. Canvas shifting in the wind. Harness rings tapping faintly against wood outside. The slow breathing of people wrapped tightly beneath layers of quilts and coats. Every noise becomes part of the strange floating half-dream that arrives when exhaustion and cold negotiate temporary peace. Then the temperature drops harder. You feel it immediately. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Just a sharper edge sliding quietly beneath the blankets until the air inside the wagon no longer feels merely uncomfortable, but actively unfriendly. You open your eyes to darkness. Somewhere nearby, snow brushes against canvas in dry whispering waves. The wagon cover flexes inward gently whenever stronger gusts push across camp. A lantern hangs low beside stacked crates, its flame reduced to a tiny amber glow that barely outlines the shapes around you. The smell inside the wagon has changed too. Less smoke now, more damp wool, more cold leather. And beneath everything, that faint mineral scent snow sometimes carries. as though the sky itself has frozen solid. You pull the blankets tighter around your shoulders and listen. Outside, somebody's awake. Boots crunch slowly through fresh snow beside the wagon wheels. A low voice murmurs to livestock. Another voice answers from farther away, nearly lost beneath the growing wind. Nobody sleeps deeply on the Oregon Trail. A recognized historical truth from emigrant diaries is that wagon camps operated almost constantly, even overnight. Livestock needed watching. Fires required tending. Weather could change rapidly. Theft remained possible. Parents often woke repeatedly to check children for warmth during freezing conditions. Rest existed mostly as a rumor people chased between chores. You shift carefully and peek through a narrow opening in the canvas flap. The world outside glows pale silver beneath moonlight filtered through clouds. Snow covers the prairie now in smooth, uneven drifts curling around wagon wheels and animal tracks. Fires burn low across camp, their orange light flickering weakly against the white landscape. It would almost look beautiful if your toes were not beginning to lose diplomatic relations with the rest of your body. You climb from beneath the blankets with enormous reluctance. The cold strikes instantly, not just on your skin, but deeper somehow, reaching through clothes and settling into joints before you even straighten fully. You pull on boots stiffened by frost and duck outside into the night air. The camp has grown quieter. Oxen stand clustered together beside the supply wagons, enormous shapes breathing clouds into darkness. Snow gathers along their backs in white ridges. One mule shakes itself irritably, bells jingling softly before settling again. Nearby, Eli crouches beside the fire pit, feeding thin strips of wood into stubborn coals. "Couldn't sleep?" he asks. You make a noise somewhere between agreement and physical suffering. He nods as though this answer fully matches his expectations of winter survival. The fire crackles weakly between you. What has already become a concern. Most wagon trains carried limited fuel supplies because extra weight slowed travel and exhausted livestock faster. Emigrants relied heavily on gathering wood, brush, or dried buffalo dung across the plains. Yes, truly. Entire cooking fires often depended on very old prairie cow contributions. The frontier possessed many romantic qualities. This was not one of them. A curious trail-era tidbit describes travellers arguing passionately about the best cooking fires. Some preferred wood whenever possible because buffalo chips burned with a strong smell many people disliked. Others claimed dung fires produced steadier heat during storms. Human civilization, it turns out, will debate absolutely anything if given enough time and insufficient entertainment. You extend frozen hands toward the flames. The warmth feels fragile tonight. Not weak exactly, just outnumbered. Snow continues falling steadily across the prairie beyond camp. The flakes look finer now, sharper, moving sideways more often than downward. Wind carries them beneath wagon covers and around collars, no matter how carefully people bundle themselves. Farther down camp, a baby begins crying. Not loudly, just tired. You hear the mother immediately trying to soothe the child while wagon boards creak softly around them. Another woman steps from a nearby wagon carrying an extra blanket without even being asked. Moments like that happen constantly on the trail. People share coffee, medicine, sewing needles, wagon grease, gossip, and exhaustion, because isolation simply is not practical this far from settled towns. Even families who dislike one another often cooperate during storms. Freezing weather has a remarkable ability to reduce pointless arguments. Usually, historians still argue how harmonious most wagon trains truly were during difficult crossings. Some diaries describe remarkable cooperation and shared sacrifice. Others reveal constant tension over supplies, leadership decisions, livestock management, and pace. The reality likely changed from camp to camp depending on personalities, weather, and sheer luck. You suspect several people here are already reconsidering previous life choices involving westward optimism. A gust of wind sweeps suddenly across camp, stronger than before. Canvas snaps sharply overhead. Snow spins through the firelight in glittering swirls while Eli glances west toward the invisible horizon. "That's building," he mutters. Nobody nearby disagrees. Within the hour and camp begins waking properly. Not because dawn has arrived, because the storm has. Voices move urgently between wagons. Lanterns brighten beneath canvas covers. Men pull heavier coats over night clothes, while women secure loose supplies against strengthening wind. Older children stumble sleepily through snow, carrying buckets or armfuls of firewood almost larger than themselves. You help tighten ropes along the wagon side while your fingers slowly stop functioning as independent citizens. The wind bites harder now. It carries tiny ice crystals sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Snow no longer drifts gently downward. Instead, it races low across the prairie in pale streams twisting around wagon wheels and animal legs. The storm is learning confidence. A lesser-known but widely accepted historical detail is that sudden prairie blizzards often arrived with terrifying speed. Travellers sometimes described clear conditions transforming into near whiteout visibility within hours. Without modern forecasts, emigrants relied entirely on observation, instinct, and experience. Which sounds romantic until you remember instinct occasionally tells humans to poke mysterious animals with sticks. Someone shouts near the livestock line. Two boys run after a frightened mule trying to pull free from its tether while snow lashes sideways through camp. Nearby fires flatten low beneath the wind. One goes out completely. The temperature keeps dropping. You can feel it in your teeth now, in your ears, in the strange brittle qualities settling over every sound. Morning still has not arrived, but darkness has changed colour slightly. The eastern horizon glows faint grey behind layers of cloud while snow thickens into dense moving curtains across the prairie. And suddenly the trail itself begins disappearing. Wheel ruts fade first beneath drifting powder, then footprints vanish, then distant wagons blur almost entirely behind blowing white. You stand beside the fire, clutching your coat tighter, while camp transforms around you into something smaller, stranger, and far more vulnerable than it seemed yesterday evening. The prairie no longer feels open, it feels endless, and winter has finally decided to step fully inside. By full morning, the storm no longer resembles weather, it resembles geography. The sky and earth blend together in endless moving white, while wind sweeps across the prairie hard enough to blur distance into nothing. You stand hunched beside the wagon line, squinting through stinging snow, and realize you can barely see the next row of wagons 50 feet away, which feels deeply unfair after crossing half a continent specifically to admire scenery. The storm answers by throwing ice crystals directly into your face. Camp erupts into motion around you. Not panic exactly, more like disciplined scrambling. People who travelled the Oregon Trail understood one important rule better than almost anyone alive today. When severe weather arrives, hesitation becomes dangerous very quickly. Every loose item must be secured, every animal checked, every fire protected, every child accounted for before visibility disappears entirely. And visibility is disappearing with remarkable enthusiasm. The wind screams suddenly across the plains strong enough to rock the wagon beside you. Canvas snaps violently overhead while ropes strain against frozen wood. Snow races sideways in thick white sheets curling around wheels and boots like ocean surf. You grab the wagon rail to steady yourself. Your gloves already feel damp despite the cold. That is another unpleasant frontier detail nobody romanticizes enough. Snow eventually finds its way into absolutely everything. Boots, sleeves, blankets, flour sacks, coffee tins, human souls. Eli shouts something through the wind and points toward the livestock line. You catch perhaps every third word. Still, the meaning becomes obvious once you see the animals. The oxen are restless now, huge shapes shifting nervously against their tethers while snow gathers thickly along their hides. One mule pulls sideways against its lead rope, ears pinned flat beneath the shrieking wind. Nearby horses stamp through deepening drift, snorting clouds of steam. Animals sense the storm escalating long before humans fully accept it. A historical fact often mentioned in emigrant journals is that livestock survival determined whether wagon trains could continue west at all. Oxen especially were prized because they handled rough trail conditions better than horses, though they moved more slowly. Losing animals during storms could strand entire families permanently, which explains why 3 men immediately plunge into the snow trying to calm the panicked mule before it injures itself. You follow Eli toward the supply wagons with your head lowered against the wind. Walking becomes strangely difficult, not because the snow is deep yet, because the air itself pushes back. Each gust slams against your coat hard enough to force uneven steps while frozen powder whips across the prairie in blinding bursts. Your cheeks burn painfully. Breathing through your scarf fills it gradually with tiny crystals of ice. Somewhere nearby, a child laughs. You turn in disbelief. Sure enough, 2 boys are attempting to chase drifting snow spirals between wagons while their mother yells for them to return before they become tiny frozen prairie legends. Children remain astonishingly committed to chaos under all historical circumstances. You reach the supply wagon where several women work quickly beneath a stretched canvas tarp protecting food crates from snow. Flour barrels are covered carefully, coffee sacks tied tighter, salt pork wrapped again against moisture. One woman hands you a bundle of firewood. "Keep this dry or we'll all be chewing frozen beans by tomorrow," she says. The seriousness of her tone suggests this outcome ranks only slightly below apocalypse. Food management during storms required constant attention on the trail. Wet flour spoiled. Frozen vegetables became useless. Coffee, however, achieved almost sacred status among emigrants. Diaries repeatedly describe travellers prioritising coffee supplies even during severe shortages because warm drinks provided comfort, stimulation, and morale. Civilization, it seems, rests upon tiny brown beans and collective emotional dependency. The wind rises further. It no longer comes in gusts now, just one endless force pressing across the prairie without pause. You help drag extra canvas over stacked crates while snow lashes your back hard enough to sound like handfuls of sand thrown against fabric. Nearby fires struggle desperately beneath iron cooking grates. Smoke blows flat sideways through camp. One fire collapses entirely into hissing black slush. The woman beside you closes her eyes briefly like someone witnessing personal betrayal. A quirky frontier account once described emigrants carrying live coals between camps, inside covered metal containers to preserve fire during storms. Some families guarded embers overnight more carefully than money. Without dry matches or reliable fuel, restarting fires in blizzards could become genuinely dangerous. Historians continue discussing whether some wagon parties relied too heavily on luck during severe weather, rather than establishing stricter storm procedures earlier in the journey. Certain journals suggest experienced trail captains enforced organised camp layouts and emergency preparation, while less organised groups often suffered greater losses during winter crossings. Looking around your current situation, you suspect organisation has become more of a hopeful philosophy than an actual condition. Snow piles quickly against wagon wheels now. The drifts climb higher by the hour, curling beneath axles and steps. Footpaths between wagons disappear almost immediately after being trampled open. People navigating camp tie scarves across faces until everyone resembles deeply exhausted snow ghosts carrying buckets. You push onward through the storm, carrying wood toward the main fire line. Halfway there, the wind nearly tears the bundle from your arms. It howls through wagon gaps with a sound strangely close to voices. Long rising moans followed by sharp whistles against canvas edges. The prairie itself seems alive now, vast, angry, impossible to reason with. And beneath that sound comes another realization. The storm may not pass quickly. That thought settles heavier than the snow. By afternoon, camp shrinks inward. Families retreat more often into wagons between chores. Conversations shorten because speaking outdoors wastes warmth and effort. Frost forms constantly along scarves, collars, eyelashes. Every object left uncovered develops a skin of ice within minutes. You step briefly into one wagon delivering extra blankets and immediately understand why people cling so fiercely to those cramped shelters. Inside feels dim but human. Warm breaths cloud the lantern light. A kettle rattles gently above a tiny stove improvised from iron scraps. Children sit wrapped together beneath quilts listening to their grandmother recite Bible verses half from memory and half from stubborn confidence. The smell of cinnamon drifts faintly from somewhere. Real cinnamon. A luxury item carefully preserved across thousands of difficult miles. That small sweetness nearly breaks your heart. Outside, the storm screams louder against the canvas. The grandmother notices your expression and smiles tiredly. Snow always sounds worse once dark comes, she says. You glance toward the fading grey light beyond the wagon flap. Darkness is indeed coming, and with it, colder temperatures, stronger wind, longer hours trapped beneath canvas while the prairie buries itself deeper around the stranded wagons. You step back outside carrying the empty wood sack. The storm greets you immediately like an insult remembered halfway through an argument. Snow spins endlessly across the plains. Lanterns already glow pale through drifting white despite the early hour. And somewhere beyond the storm, beyond the invisible hills and buried trail, the west still waits patiently. But tonight nobody's moving toward it. Darkness settles over the prairie long before evening should properly begin. The storm thickens the sky into a heavy grey ceiling that swallows daylight hour by hour until the entire camp glows with the strange dimness of permanent twilight. Snow lashes sideways through the wagon line while lanterns flicker weakly behind canvas walls like tiny ships lost at sea. You duck your head against the wind and hurry toward your wagon, carrying 2 extra blankets beneath one arm. The cold feels sharper now, more serious, as though winter has stopped introducing itself politely and started making long-term plans. Canvas snaps violently overhead the moment you climb inside. Eli follows close behind, dropping the wagon flap shut against the storm while snow scatters across the floorboards in sparkling little bursts. Immediately the world changes. Outside remains all shrieking wind and frozen emptiness. Inside becomes breath, shadows, crowded elbows, and warmth that exists only because human beings are stubborn enough to create it. The wagon interior feels even smaller tonight. Every object has shifted slightly inward to conserve space and heat. Crates stack tighter beneath benches. Wet gloves hang from rope lines overhead beside socks attempting recovery from snow-related trauma. A lantern swings softly near the wagon bow, casting amber light across tired faces. You settle carefully among the blankets while Eli wedges another coat along the lower canvas edge to block drifting snow. It almost works. Almost. A respected historical detail from trail diaries is that emigrant wagons were not designed primarily for passenger comfort. Most adults walked beside the wagons for large portions of the journey, while supplies filled much of the interior space. During storms, however, entire families often crowded inside together for shelter despite cramped conditions, and cramp truly becomes the defining architectural theme of frontier survival. Your knees immediately collide with somebody else's boots. A child somewhere near the back shifts beneath quilts and accidentally elbows a tin cup hard enough to produce a noise suggesting civilization itself may collapse. Nobody complains, at least not loudly. The storm outside complains enough for everyone. Wind roars across the prairie in relentless waves, rattling wagon boards and making the canvas walls flex inward like breathing lungs. Snow scrapes constantly against the exterior with a dry brushing sound, almost like sandpaper. You begin understanding why travelers describe blizzards as exhausting, even while standing still. The noise never stops. Neither does the tension. Every creak feels important. Every stronger gust makes you wonder whether the wagon cover will hold. A less familiar but fascinating trail-era custom involved some emigrant families sewing extra interior cloth linings inside wagon covers during colder months. These makeshift layers trapped warmth surprisingly well, and reduced drifting snow indoors. Others stuffed gaps with spare clothing, buffalo fur, or even dried grass. Human beings possess endless creativity whenever freezing becomes personally inconvenient. Across from you, an older woman unwraps a small cloth bundle revealing slices of dried apple carefully preserved since Missouri. The smell fills the wagon instantly. Sweet, faintly smoky, almost impossibly comforting. She passes the slices around slowly, one to each person. Nobody takes more than their share. That quiet discipline matters on the trail. Supplies measured poorly in autumn became desperation by winter. Many emigrant accounts confirm that families tracked food with extraordinary care during difficult crossings. Flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, and dried fruit formed the foundation of trail diets. Fresh food vanished quickly except where hunting succeeded. Storm delays made ration planning even more critical, because trapped wagon trains consumed supplies without making westward progress. You chew the apple slice slowly while listening to the storm. Its sweetness tastes like memory itself. Home kitchens, summer sunlight, civilization with walls that do not flap violently in the wind. Outside, somebody shouts. The sound reaches the wagon only faintly beneath the storm, but Eli immediately stiffens and reaches for his coat. Probably another loose tether, he mutters. You watch him disappear into the white darkness beyond the wagon flap. Cold air rushes briefly inside before the canvas drops shut again, and suddenly the wagon feels much smaller without him. The lantern sways overhead. The child near the back coughs quietly beneath the blankets. A young mother rocks her baby slowly while humming under her breath, in a rhythm nearly drowned by the wind. You realize something strange then. The wagon itself has become an entire world. Not a vehicle anymore. A border. Outside lies storm, danger, confusion, freezing darkness. Inside exist warmth, breath, food, family, and whatever fragile safety can be stitched together from wood and canvas. Some scholars continue questioning how emigrant families managed emotional strain during prolonged weather delays, especially when trapped in confined spaces for days at a time. Diaries often mention boredom, anxiety, and arguments only briefly despite obvious stress. Historians suspect many personal tensions simply went unrecorded because survival demanded practical focus over emotional reflection, which honestly sounds like an exhausting way to process feelings. The wagon rocks hard beneath a stronger gust. Snow rattles sharply against the sideboards. For a moment everyone falls silent listening. Then the baby sneezes. The entire wagon relaxes immediately. Tiny sounds become strangely reassuring during storms, proof that ordinary life continues despite the weather, trying its absolute best to become a personality trait. The older woman begins telling a story softly about crossing rivers farther east during spring floods. She describes wagons floating briefly, oxen swimming, one man losing his hat and mourning it more dramatically than a distant cousin. People laugh quietly, not loudly enough to waste energy, just enough. You notice how laughter changes the wagon atmosphere almost instantly. Shoulders loosen, faces soften. Fear pulls back slightly from the edges of conversation. Outside, the storm still howls endlessly across the plains, but inside, people remain people. That matters. Another authentic detail from the Oregon Trail period is that storytelling served as essential entertainment during long evenings. Families sang hymns, recited poetry, read newspapers months out of date, and retold familiar stories repeatedly. Shared amusement became a practical survival tool against isolation and fear. Eventually Eli returns coated nearly white with snow. The wind slams the wagon flap behind him while he stomps frozen powder from his boots. Animals are holding, he says, which apparently qualifies as good news tonight. You shift deeper beneath the blankets while the lantern light grows softer overhead. The warmth inside the wagon remains uneven. One side of your face feels almost comfortable, while your toes continue conducting independent negotiations with mortality. Still, compared to the storm outside, this cramped wagon now feels luxurious beyond reason. The sounds of camp fade gradually as more families settle inward for the night. Fires burn lower beneath the snow. Voices disappear one by one behind canvas walls. Only the wind remains fully awake. It circles endlessly around the stranded wagon train, sweeping over buried prairie grass and invisible trail ruts somewhere beneath the snow. And inside the wagons, dozens of families lie listening together in the dark, waiting to learn how long winter intends staying. The fire nearly dies before dawn. You smell it first. Not smoke exactly, but the absence of smoke. The fading warmth, that subtle change in air when glowing embers shrink beneath too much ash and too little fuel. Inside the wagon, everyone senses it at almost the same moment. Blankets tighten. People shift closer together. The baby begins fussing softly before the cold fully settles in. Ely mutters something tired beneath his breath and reaches immediately for his boots. Because on the prairie during winter, fire is not comfort anymore. It is infrastructure. You push yourself upright beneath the quilts while the wagon creaks around you. Frost traces pale patterns along the inner canvas where warm breath froze during the night. Tiny crystals glitter faintly in lantern light like delicate embroidery stitched by deeply hostile weather. Outside, the storm still moves across the plains, though differently now. Less screaming, more steady. Snow brushes against the wagon in endless dry whispers, while the wind moans low across buried grasslands beyond camp. You can no longer tell where the trail runs. The earth itself has disappeared beneath white drifts and darkness. You step outside carrying an armful of wood. The cold strikes instantly through every layer of clothing. Your breath clouds thick before your face. Snow squeaks beneath your boots with that strange brittle sound frozen ground makes only in severe temperatures. Nearby fires burn weakly in shallow pits protected by wagon wheels, crates, and hastily stacked barriers of snow. People move through camp like slow shadows wrapped in wool and frost. Nobody wastes motion. Every task matters now. A widely accepted historical reality of trail survival is that maintaining fire during winter weather demanded constant labour. Travellers rose repeatedly overnight to feed flames, protect embers, and search for usable fuel. Without heat, cooking became impossible and freezing injuries far more likely, which explains why everyone stares at fires the way modern people stare at phone batteries during power outages. You kneel beside the main fire pit while Ely carefully stirs glowing coals beneath layers of ash. The heat feels astonishing, tiny, fragile, yet somehow powerful enough to gather half the camp around it before sunrise. Someone passes you a bundle of dried prairie grass for kindling. Someone else adds broken wagon boards shaved carefully into thin strips. A woman carries over buffalo chips gathered earlier beneath less terrible weather conditions. And there it is again! Frontier civilization returning bravely to the topic of burning old cow remains. Honestly, the Oregon Trail deserves credit for teaching generations that survival occasionally requires setting dignity gently aside. The new flames catch slowly. First a glow, then faint crackling, then finally a narrow tongue of orange light stretching upward through the grey dawn air. Everyone nearby watches with the same quiet concentration usually reserved for surgery or diplomacy. Firelight spreads across frozen faces. Shoulders relax slightly. A small victory has occurred. An unusual but documented trail practice involved emigrants banking fires beneath thick ash overnight to preserve coals until morning. Some families became remarkably skilled at transporting live embers between camps using iron kettles or buried containers. Restarting a fire from scratch during snowstorms consumed precious time, fuel, and energy. You extend numb hands toward the flames while snow drifts softly around the camp. The morning light remains weak and colourless behind clouds. Wagons sit half-buried now along their lower edges. Canvas covers sag beneath gathered snow. Ropes hang stiff with ice. The creek nearby has nearly vanished beneath frozen crust and wind-blown drifts. Everything appears quieter after a storm settles into endurance rather than violence. Not safer, just quieter. Coffee begins brewing beside the fire. The smell moves through camp almost magically. Rich, bitter, warm. You watch exhausted people lift their heads immediately like flowers turning towards sunlight. One man abandons an argument halfway through a sentence the moment he notices the kettle. Priorities reveal themselves quickly on the frontier. Several first-hand accounts from emigrants describe coffee as emotionally essential during difficult crossings. Travellers traded valuable goods for it, rationed it carefully, and celebrated finding extra supplies in abandoned forts or settlements. Warm drinks provided not only heat but psychological stability during long periods of hardship. You accept a tin cup carefully between frozen fingers. The metal burns almost painfully against your skin. The first sip tastes smoky and slightly gritty from ash blowing into the kettle. It is magnificent. Nearby, a woman cooks small cakes of cornmeal over a flat iron pan while children huddle close beneath blankets. Snow gathers constantly along coat shoulders and hat brims despite the fire. The heat never reaches far. That becomes the strange truth of prairie fires. You must stay close enough to feel them. Too close and smoke blinds you. Too far and winter reclaims your bones immediately. Some researchers continue discussing how emigrant camps balance fuel conservation with the psychological importance of visible fires. Diaries reveal that even when supplies ran dangerously low, families often maintained gathering fires for morale and social connection rather than retreating entirely into wagons. Because humans need warmth in more ways than one, the wind shifts suddenly, carrying sparks sideways through camp. Everyone reacts instantly. Blankets thrown over supply crates, children pulled back, snow kicked hurriedly across loose embers near the wagon wheels. Fire keeps you alive. Fire also remains extremely interested in destroying everything you own. The relationship feels complicated. By midday, camp settles into a rhythm centered entirely around heat. People rotate between wagons and fire pits in careful patterns. Gloves dry beside flames while boots thaw enough to become wearable again. Soup kettles simmer slowly whenever fuel allows. Wet scarves hang from wagon bows like exhausted surrender flags. You help gather more burnable material from beneath the supply tarps. There is less than you hoped. Broken crates, splintered branches collected days earlier, bundles of dried grass. Nothing feels sufficient. A rarely mentioned detail from trail journals describes emigrants burning unexpected objects during emergencies, including furniture pieces, tool handles, and damaged wagon parts, once trapped by snow. Practical necessity often overruled long-term planning, which sounds reasonable until you imagine explaining to future generations that the family heirloom rocking chair became bean heating fuel during one unfortunate Tuesday in Wyoming. Afternoon fades early again beneath heavy clouds. The fire lines glow brighter as daylight weakens. Smoke drifts low across camp, carrying scents of coffee, cornmeal, damp wool, and melting snow. You sit close beside the flames, listening to quiet conversation around you. Nobody talks much about reaching Oregon anymore. Not tonight. People discuss weather, animals, fuel, whether tomorrow's wind might ease slightly, whether the creek ice will hold, whether the flour stayed dry beneath the wagon canvas. Survival narrows the world into immediate practical things. And yet the firelight creates something softer too. Faces illuminated gold against drifting snow. Low laughter. Shared cups passed carefully between cold hands. Tiny circles of warmth resisting the enormous frozen prairie. You stare into the flames while darkness settles slowly across the buried trail once again. The fire crackles softly. Snow falls beyond the light. And for now, at least, the camp still burns against the winter. By the third snowbound morning, meals begin feeling smaller. Not alarmingly small yet. Nobody is starving, but you notice the differences. Coffee cups filled slightly lower than before. Bacon sliced thinner. Flour measured with greater care. Children encouraged gently but firmly not to waste crumbs while mothers scrape kettles more thoroughly after supper. The storm outside continues drifting across the prairie with stubborn patience. And every hour trapped here means another hour of supplies disappearing. You crouch beside the cooking fire while snowflakes melt softly against your coat sleeves. Nearby, A woman named Martha kneads dough inside a wooden bowl balanced carefully on her lap beneath layers of blankets. Her fingers move automatically despite the cold. Press, fold, turn. The rhythm feels ancient somehow. Human beings surviving winter through bread and determination. A firmly established historical detail of Oregon Trail travel is that emigrant diets relied heavily on simple, durable staples: flour, cornmeal, bacon, beans, coffee, rice, and dried fruit form the backbone of most wagon provisions because they survived long journeys better than fresh foods. Unfortunately, no amount of frontier optimism transforms salted pork into exciting cuisine after 5 consecutive months. Martha glances into the nearly empty flour sack beside her. "We'll make it stretch," she says quietly. You notice she says it like a promise rather than a hope. Around the fire, breakfast cooks slowly. Cornmeal cakes hiss against iron pans while beans simmer in a soot-blackened kettle suspended over low flames. Someone unwraps a tiny piece of dried apple for the children to share. Someone else adds snow carefully into another pot to melt for water. The smell drifting through camp is oddly comforting despite its simplicity. Smoke, coffee, wet wool, bacon grease, burning wood mixed faintly with buffalo fuel. The scent of people refusing to quit. You accept a tin plate holding one small corn cake and a spoonful of beans. The food is hot enough to sting your mouth. You almost welcome the pain. Warmth counts as flavour now. A peculiar frontier tidbit appears in several emigrant journals describing elaborate conversations about imaginary meals during difficult crossings. Travellers apparently passed evenings discussing roast chicken, fresh pies, buttered bread, oysters, and cakes in nearly poetic detail while eating beans beside muddy fires. Human imagination becomes surprisingly culinary once trapped in bad weather. One man in camp claims he would trade an entire silver watch for fresh peaches. Nobody laughs because several people seem genuinely tempted. The wind eases briefly by midday, not enough to travel, just enough for camp activity to spread outward again. Wagons open, blankets air beside the fires. People scrape accumulated snow from wheels and axles while children stomp paths between campsites. You help Martha and 2 others reorganize food crates beneath a canvas tarp weighted down with frozen ropes. Inside the supply wagon, everything smells dense and dry. Coffee sacks, flour dust, leather harnesses, salt pork wrapped in cloth. You realize quickly how carefully every item must be protected. Moisture ruins flour. Freezing temperatures crack containers. Mice, when available. Apparently consider wagon supplies an open invitation to criminal opportunity. Trail emigrants developed countless methods for protecting food during harsh travel. Diaries describe barrels lined with cloth, flour sealed in waxed containers, meat packed in salt, and delicate items wrapped repeatedly against dampness. Families who organized provisions poorly often suffered badly later in the journey. Which makes sense. A wagon train is basically a moving argument between survival and limited storage space. Martha hands you a sack of beans to stack near the rear wall. It feels heavier than expected. Not physically, emotionally. Every bag represents days of future meals, future warmth, future movement westward. You suddenly understand why people guarded food supplies with such seriousness on the trail. Outside, laughter rises unexpectedly from near the livestock line. You step from the wagon to investigate. 2 boys have built tiny snow figures beside the oxen pens using bits of charcoal for faces and strips of cloth for scarves. One snow figure apparently represents Eli because somebody added an impressive beard using frozen grass. The resemblance is unfortunately accurate. Even Eli laughs when he sees it. Only briefly, though. The cold steals humour quickly out here. Scholars continue discussing how emigrant families maintained morale during prolonged delays and shortages. Some historians emphasize religious faith and communal cooperation, while others point toward routine itself. Cooking, cleaning, storytelling, and shared chores created psychological structure during uncertain conditions. That theory feels believable while watching camp today. People keep moving because movement itself resists despair. By afternoon, snow begins falling harder again. The wind returns slowly, carrying thin, icy needles through camp. Fires shrink lower beneath protective barriers, while families retreat inward once more. Supper preparations begin earlier now. Fuel must be conserved. Cooking before darkness saves effort and reduces risk once temperatures plunge overnight. You sit beside the fire, helping slice bacon into narrow strips nearly transparent with thinness. Nearby, a kettle of rice cooks slowly while someone stirs beans, seasoned with tiny precious bits of onion preserved from weeks earlier. The smell alone lifts spirits noticeably. Amazing what one onion can accomplish for civilization. An overlooked but authentic detail from trail life is that spices and small luxuries became emotionally valuable during difficult periods. Cinnamon, dried apples, molasses, or preserved fruit often appeared in diaries with surprising affection because they interrupted the monotony of trail food and reminded families of home. Tonight, Martha adds the smallest pinch of cinnamon to a pot of boiled apples. The entire camp notices immediately. Heads lift. Children drift closer. One man actually closes his eyes while inhaling. Nobody has seen luxury in weeks, yet suddenly the air smells faintly like holidays. You eat slowly beside the fire while snow falls steadily beyond the lantern glow. The meal remains simple. Rice, beans, thin bacon, a spoonful of sweet apple. Yet every bite feels earned. You notice people speaking more softly tonight. Exhaustion settles deeper after days trapped by weather. Movements slow. Faces look thinner in firelight. Even the children curl closer beneath blankets without argument. Still, nobody talks openly about fear. Not directly. Instead, they discuss supplies. How many sacks remain? Whether hunting becomes possible if the weather clears. How long flour can last if rationed carefully. Practical conversations carrying emotional weight beneath every sentence. The fires burn low as darkness thickens across the buried prairie once more. You finish the last of your coffee listening to the wind move beyond the wagons. Inside nearby canvas shelters, families prepare another careful meal, another long freezing night, another morning of uncertain weather and measured food. And somewhere beneath all that drifting snow, the westward trail still waits patiently for travellers who have temporarily become winter's reluctant guests. The animals begin sounding different after a week in the snow. At first you do not notice it clearly, only small changes beneath the ordinary camp noise. The oxen breathe heavier while resting. Horses stamp more often against the frozen ground. Mules complain with low, restless brays whenever the wind sharpens after sunset. Then one morning you wake before dawn and realize the entire camp listens for those sounds constantly. Because silence from the livestock would be far worse. You step from the wagon wrapped tightly in blankets and coat layers, while snow crunches beneath your boots. The storm has weakened overnight, leaving the prairie strangely still beneath pale grey clouds. Frost coats everything. Wagon wheels, harness buckles, the edges of canvas covers. Even your eyelashes feel stiff almost immediately. Across camp, dark animal shapes stand clustered beside snow-packed pens built from wagon tongues, crates, and sheer frontier improvisation. Steam rises from their bodies in slow drifting clouds. You head toward them carrying a bucket of melted snow water. The smell reaches you first. Warm animal breath. Hay, leather, wet fur. Not pleasant exactly, but deeply alive, after days surrounded by frozen wind and endless white emptiness. Even the scent of stubborn oxen feels oddly reassuring. A foundational truth of Oregon Trail travel is that emigrants depended entirely on livestock for movement and survival. Oxen pulled most wagons because they handled rough terrain, and scarce grazing better than horses. Families often cared for animals before feeding themselves during difficult weather, because losing draft animals could end the journey completely, which means the oxen effectively outrank everyone except perhaps coffee. One massive brindled ox lifts its head as you approach. Snow clings to the fur around its nose. Frost outlines its eyelashes in delicate white crystals. It watches you with the calm, exhausted expression of a creature that has dragged human ambition across half a continent against its better judgment. Fair criticism, honestly. Nearby, Eli and two others work carefully untangling frozen harness straps stiff as boards in the cold. Leather becomes troublesome during winter storms. Buckles freeze, reins crack, wet ropes turn rigid overnight. Every task takes twice as long once snow enters the conversation. You help scatter feed across packed ground while the animals shift forward eagerly. Not enough feed remains. You can tell by the way people measure portions now. Carefully, quietly. Nobody says the numbers aloud. Several emigrant diaries mention how difficult it became keeping livestock fed during late-season crossings. Snow-buried prairie grass beneath ice and drifts. Wagon trains carrying limited grain often struggle to balance animal needs against supply weight earlier in the journey. The mathematics of survival rarely favours optimism. A curious frontier anecdote tells of travellers hanging bells from lead oxen during blizzards, so wandering animals could be located in whiteout conditions. Some emigrants even claimed certain experienced oxen learned trail commands better than newly arrived teamsters, which means somewhere in 19th century America, a very intelligent ox probably spent months wondering why humans remain so dramatically underqualified. The morning stays painfully cold despite calmer weather. You rub your gloved hands together repeatedly while helping clear ice from water troughs. Nearby, children carry armfuls of hay nearly larger than themselves toward the livestock pens. One little boy slips directly into a snowbank and emerges furious but unharmed, which feels emotionally accurate for winter travel in general. The horses appear more nervous than the oxen. They toss their heads frequently and paw at the snow searching for buried grass. One mare refuses water until Martha quietly strokes its neck and murmurs to it for nearly 10 straight minutes. Eventually the animal drinks. You suspect half the camp responds better to Martha's voice than actual leadership decisions. By midday, weak sunlight filters through thinning clouds for the first time in days. The entire camp notices immediately. People emerge from wagons almost instinctively, turning faces upward toward the pale brightness. Blankets air across wagon rails. Wet clothing hangs beside fires. Children run clumsy circles through the snow despite repeated warnings about boots and frostbite. Even the animals seem calmer beneath the faint light. Some historians continue debating how much emotional attachment emigrant families form toward their livestock during long journeys. Certain diaries describe oxen and horses almost as co-workers or companions rather than property, especially after months of shared hardship. Looking around camp now, that theory feels difficult to dismiss. People know these animals individually, which ox pulls hardest uphill, which mule bites, which horse startles during storms. Shared survival creates familiarity quickly. You join Eli repairing a damaged harness near the wagon line while the animals feed nearby. The leather feels cold and brittle beneath your fingers. Snowmelt dampens the straps despite careful drying. Eli works patiently, threading new stitching through cracked sections while occasionally glancing toward the western horizon. You hear them before storms sometimes, he says suddenly. The animals, he nods. They get quieter. You look toward the oxen. Right now they chew steadily through hay while steam drifts from their backs into pale afternoon air. Bells clink softly whenever one shifts position. The sound feels comforting, steady, grounded. Like proof the camp still exists beneath all this snow. An overlooked but genuine detail from trail accounts describes emigrants sleeping near livestock during severe weather, to discourage theft or wandering. Some travellers claimed hearing oxen breathing nearby made storms feel less lonely at night, which may sound sentimental until you spend a week trapped on a frozen prairie listening to wind attempt murder against canvas walls. Late afternoon brings another problem. One mule refuses to stand. The news spreads quickly through camp because everything involving animals matters immediately now. You follow Eli through the snow toward the far wagon row where several men kneel beside the collapsed animal. Its sides heave heavily. Face clings around its muzzle. Nobody speaks loudly. The tension around sick livestock always feels strangely personal. A respected historical observation from emigrant journals notes that animal exhaustion often became one of the greatest threats during prolonged delays. Poor grazing, freezing temperatures, and overwork weakened teams quickly. Replacing lost animals on isolated sections of the trail could prove nearly impossible. The mule eventually struggles upright after blankets, rubbing, and considerable encouragement involving language unsuitable for church settings. A small victory, but still a warning. Evening settles slowly across camp beneath calmer skies at last. The first stars appear faintly overhead, while fires brighten against the snow-covered wagons. The animals cluster together near their feed lines, dark, patient shapes against the pale prairie. You stand beside the pens listening, low breathing, harness bells, the crunch of hay, soft snorts drifting into freezing air. Such ordinary sounds. Yet out here they carry enormous weight, because without those animals the wagons never move again, and somewhere beyond the snow-buried plains, the West still waits for creatures both human and stubborn enough to keep going. The coughing starts quietly enough that nobody mentions it at first. Just scattered sounds drifting through camp during the night. A rough cough from one wagon, a child clearing his throat near the fire line, someone breathing harder after carrying water through deep snow. Ordinary winter noises, or at least noises people desperately want to believe are ordinary. You wake before dawn listening to the wind brush softly against the wagon canvas, while another cough echoes somewhere outside. Then another, then silence again. The stillness afterward feels heavier than the sound itself. Inside the wagon, the air has grown thick from too many breaths trapped overnight beneath frozen canvas. Moisture clings to blankets. Frost gathers along the seams overhead. Every inhale carries traces of smoke, wool, damp leather, and human exhaustion. The baby sleeping near the rear wagon bow wheezes faintly in her dreams. Her mother notices immediately. Mothers always do. You sit upright beneath the quilts while Eli reaches automatically for the lantern. Its soft glow reveals tired faces emerging slowly from blankets around you. Nobody says the word illness. Not yet. An accepted historical reality of Oregon Trail travel is that sickness followed emigrants constantly. Respiratory infections spread easily during cold weather, especially inside crowded wagons with limited ventilation and poor nutrition. Children and older travelers faced the greatest risk during harsh winter conditions. The frontier did not particularly care whether your immune system felt prepared for adventure. Outside, dawn arrives pale and weak beneath low clouds. You step carefully into the freezing morning carrying a kettle toward the fire pits. Snow crunches sharply underfoot. The air feels painfully cold inside your lungs, almost metallic. Can't move slower today. That becomes obvious immediately. People emerge from wagons with stiff, cautious motions. Several faces appear flushed from fever or windburn. One older man sits wrapped in blankets beside the fire, staring into the flames, while coughing into a handkerchief already darkened with soot and melted snow. The fire crackles softly. Nobody speaks much around it. You kneel beside Martha while she heats water in an iron pot. For tea you ask quietly. She nods. Willow bark and mint. The smell rises faintly through the steam. Sharp! Herbal. Almost comforting. Many emigrant families carried homemade remedies during western migrations. Herbal teas, poultices, mustard plasters, vinegar tonics, and camphor appeared regularly in trail journals. Professional medical care remained scarce across most of the route, forcing families to rely heavily on practical knowledge and improvisation. Some remedies probably helped. Others likely just tasted extremely committed. A lesser-known trail-era practice involved placing heated stones wrapped in cloth beneath blankets to warm sick travelers during freezing nights. Families sometimes rotated hot rocks between wagons because fuel remained too precious for constant fire inside every shelter. You carry cups of steaming tea toward the older man beside the fire. His daughter accepts one gratefully before adjusting another blanket around his shoulders. Frost clings to his beard despite sitting inches from the flames. The sight unsettles you more than the storm ever did. Snow feels external. Illness moves inward. Across camp. More coughing rises through the cold air now that you notice it properly. Dry coughs. Deep chest coughs. Children coughing in sharp little bursts before being hushed gently by tired parents. Even the animals seem quieter today. A scholarly debate continues regarding how emigrants emotionally process sickness during overland travel. Many diaries describe deaths or illness with startling brevity compared to modern expectations. Some historians believe emotional restraint reflected cultural norms of the period. Others argue survival demands simply left little space for extended reflection during crises. You suspect both explanations carry truth. When survival tasks never stop, grief must wait its turn. The wind strengthens slightly by midday, sweeping fine snow across camp again. Fires burn low beneath iron kettles while people remain bundled tightly against the cold. Inside one wagon, a little girl develops fever. You help Martha carry hot water and blankets through the snow, while her mother sits beside the child stroking damp hair away from flushed cheeks. The wagon smells of sweat, smoke, and medicinal herbs. Lantern light flickers softly across worried faces. The child murmurs something half asleep about summer peaches. Nobody corrects her. An unusual but documented detail from emigrant accounts mentions travellers craving fresh fruit intensely during long journeys. Vitamin deficiencies became common after months without fresh produce. Dried apples and preserved berries were treasured whenever available. Right now, even the memory of peaches sounds luxurious beyond reason. Martha mixes herbs carefully into steaming water while explaining quietly how to ease fever. Her voice remains calm, practical, steady. You notice everyone in camp listens more carefully to calm people now. Panic wastes heat. Afternoon drifts slowly onward. Snow falls again in thin, swirling patterns beyond the wagons while camp settles into uneasy routine. Water must still be melted. Fires still fed. Animals still checked. Survival chores continue regardless of illness. That feels strangely cruel at first, then strangely comforting. Routine keeps fear from growing too large. A respected historical observation from frontier journals notes that women often served as primary medical caregivers during trail travel, combining practical nursing knowledge with household management under extremely difficult conditions. Their labour rarely received dramatic attention, despite proving essential to survival, which means history occasionally owes entire chapters to exhausted women carrying kettles through snowstorms. By evening, the older man's coughing worsens. You hear it clearly from across camp while helping gather fuel near the supply wagons. Deep, painful sounds followed by long stretches of silence. People glance toward the wagon each time. Nobody comments. The silence itself becomes a form of prayer. Supper cooks slowly over low fires. Then bean stew tonight. Coffee rationed carefully. A little molasses added to warm water for the children because morale apparently requires at least occasional negotiations with sweetness. The smell drifting through camp feels softer than before, less lively, more tired. You sit close beside the fire wrapped in blankets while darkness settles over the snow-buried prairie once again. Nearby, someone begins humming an old hymn under their breath. Others join quietly, not singing fully, just enough to fill the cold air with something human. The coughing continues beyond the lantern light. Wind brushes softly against the wagons. Snow drifts steadily across the buried trail, and the camp waits together through another freezing night, listening carefully for every breath still moving inside the darkness. Morning arrives quietly after the long night of coughing. Too quietly. The wind has finally weakened enough that you can hear smaller sounds across camp again. Boots stepping through packed snow, harness bells shifting softly near the livestock pens, the crackle of someone rebuilding a fire from buried coals, and underneath it all comes another sound. Shovels. Scrape, lift, throw, repeat. You push aside the wagon flap and stare out across the prairie. The storm has passed. At least for now. Clouds drift high and thin overhead while pale winter sunlight spills weakly across endless fields of snow. The entire landscape glows silver-white beneath the cold morning sky. Wagon wheels sit buried halfway to their spokes. Drifts lean against canvas covers in smooth, frozen curves. The trail itself has vanished completely. Not hidden, gone. You step carefully into the snow and sink nearly to your knees beside the wagon. Well, that feels discouraging. Across camp, people are already digging. Not because anyone feels energetic. Quite the opposite. Everyone moves with the stiff, deliberate motions of bodies that slept poorly and woke colder than expected. But survival on the Oregon Trail rarely paused for comfort. Snow around the wagons must be cleared. Paths reopened. Supply crates uncovered. Animal pens reinforced before the next storm arrives. And there will always be another storm eventually. A broadly recognized historical fact is that emigrants trapped by severe weather often spent entire days simply restoring camp functionality after storms passed. Clearing wheels, repairing frozen equipment, reopening fire pits, and digging out livestock consumed enormous amounts of labor and energy, which means the frontier occasionally resembled an outdoor snow removal project with existential consequences. You grab a shovel, lean in beside the supply wagon, and join Eli near the buried wheel line. The snow feels deceptively light near the surface, then heavier beneath, packed hard by wind and freezing temperatures until each shovel strike lands with a sharp icy crunch. Your arms ache almost immediately. Breath fogs heavily around your scarf. Snow slips constantly into your boots despite every effort to prevent it. After 10 minutes, you're exhausted. After 20, you understand why entire wagon trains feared early winter. Nearby, Martha and 2 others clear pathways between fire pits while children drag smaller piles away using broken crate boards as makeshift sleds. One boy becomes distracted halfway through and crashes deliberately into a drift, laughing hard enough to earn immediate disapproval from 3 adults simultaneously. Even during hardship, children somehow locate recreational opportunities. A strange but authentic detail from trail diaries mentions emigrant children using buffalo ribs, crate lids, or frozen hides as improvised sleds during snow delays. Adults often tolerated the play because restless children trapped in wagons became considerably more difficult than snow itself. Human history repeatedly confirms one truth: bored children are stronger than weather. By midday, the camp begins emerging from beneath the drifts. Wagon wheels reappear first, then supply crates, then frozen pathways linking fires, livestock pens, and shelters together once more. The work changes the atmosphere noticeably. People speak louder now. Faces show colour again from exertion. Even the coughing from yesterday seems less frightening beneath sunlight and movement. You stop briefly beside the main fire line, wiping sweat from your forehead despite the freezing air. The smell of wet wool and melting snow rises everywhere. Fires burn stronger this morning, fed by newly uncovered fuel supplies. Steam curls upward from kettles where snowmelt heats slowly for coffee and soup. The camp feels alive again. Tired, cold, but alive. Some researchers studying emigrant journals continue discussing how physical labor affected morale during difficult crossings. Several accounts suggest hard communal work reduced fear because it restored routine and purpose. Other scholars argue the exhausting demands simply distracted travelers temporarily from larger dangers. Either way, nobody sitting idle survives long out here. Ely calls you toward the rear wagon line where several men struggle uncovering a wheel nearly buried solid beneath frozen drift layers. You join them with a shovel. Scrape, lift, throw. The rhythm becomes strangely hypnotic after a while. Snow flies into bright sunlight, sparkling like crushed glass. Boots crunch through packed drifts. Someone curses softly after striking hidden ice beneath the wagon tongue. Someone else starts humming beneath their breath while digging, tiny ordinary noises returning to camp. One lesser-known trail account describes emigrants holding informal digging contests after severe storms, partly for efficiency, and partly to maintain morale. Rewards apparently included extra coffee, bragging rights, or first choice of fire position during supper. Civilization survives through competition and warm beverages. By afternoon, the wagon wheels finally stand free enough to move again if necessary. That realization spreads quietly through camp. Not excitement exactly, more cautious relief. Movement may become possible soon. You climb atop one drift overlooking the camp while catching your breath. The view stops you completely. Snow stretches endlessly across the prairie in every direction. The wagon train appears tiny against the vast frozen landscape. Little clusters of wood, smoke, canvas, and human persistence surrounded by unimaginable distance. No towns, no rows, no fences, just white plains rolling west beneath pale winter light. You suddenly understand why so many emigrants describe the frontier as both beautiful and terrifying at exactly the same time. The older man who spent days coughing sits wrapped in blankets beside a fire below. He looks weak but awake, nearby. The feverish little girl helps stack firewood while her mother watches carefully. Small victories again, the kind people cling to during hard journeys. Late sunlight turns golden briefly across the snowfields while camp continues digging and rebuilding. Children stomp new pathways between wagons. Oxen feed more comfortably from uncovered troughs. Fires burn brighter beneath calmer skies. For the first time in days, conversation shifts beyond immediate survival. People discuss the trail again, the mountains ahead, how deep the snow might remain farther west. Whether the next crossing will be easier once movement resumes, hope returns carefully, like someone testing uncertain ice. You lean on the shovel, listening to distant voices drift across the cold prairie air. Snow still surrounds the camp. Winter still waits beyond the horizon, but tonight the wagons stand uncovered once more beneath the fading light. And after days trapped inside the storm, that almost feels like progress. By the next morning, everyone understands the problem fully. The trail is gone. You stand at the western edge of camp staring across the prairie, while weak sunlight glitters over miles of untouched snow. Somewhere beneath those smooth white drifts lies the Oregon Trail, carved by thousands of wagon wheels over years of migration. But now there is nothing. No ruts, no markers, no visible direction at all. Only endless frozen land stretching toward distant hills blurred pale blue against the horizon. The realization settles strangely quiet across camp. Nobody panics. That phase passed days ago. Instead, people speak in lower voices while studying maps, landmarks, and the shape of distant terrain with increasing seriousness. Because snow does not merely hide the road, it erases certainty. You pull your coat tighter against the morning cold and watch Eli kneel beside a rough trail map spread over an overturned crate. Several others stand nearby, squinting westward between discussions. The map itself looks exhausted, creased, stained, edges softened by months of travel. One mainstream historical reality of the Oregon Trail is that much of the route was not a formal road at all. Travelers followed wagon ruts, landmarks, river valleys, guidebooks, and the experience of earlier emigrants. Heavy snow could easily obscure those visual guides and make navigation dangerously uncertain, which feels slightly alarming when your entire migration strategy depends on following dirt scratches across a continent. A gust of wind sweeps powdery snow across the camp. Children chase it briefly before adults remind them that invisible roads and freezing weather currently outrank recreational priorities. You walk farther beyond the wagon line, where several scouts examine the landscape through spyglasses. One points toward distant rock formations barely visible through the winter haze. Could be the ridgeline, he says, or drift shadow, another replies. That sentence somehow captures the entire emotional atmosphere of frontier travel. Possibly hope, possibly snow. Difficult to say. A fascinating trail era detail appears in several emigrant accounts describing how experienced guides used subtle clues to locate hidden roads after storms, bent grass, distant river courses, isolated tree clusters, An even old campfire remains sometimes helps travellers recover lost routes, which means 19th century trail navigation occasionally resembled detective work performed by extremely cold people. The camp continues functioning around you while discussions unfold, fires crackle beneath the iron kettles, oxen feed from uncovered troughs, women shake snow from blankets draped over wagon rails. Children stomp narrow pathways between drifts until the camp resembles a tiny snowy village temporarily dropped into the middle of nowhere. Still, an undercurrent of tension moves through every conversation. If the trail cannot be found safely, the wagon train remains trapped, and supplies continue shrinking. You notice people counting things more often now. Firewood bundles, flour sacks, animal feed, days. The arithmetic of survival has become impossible to ignore. Some historians continue examining whether many emigrant parties relied too heavily on memory and instinct when snow obscured western routes. Certain diaries describe remarkable confidence from experienced trail leaders, while others reveal frequent disagreements over landmarks and direction once visibility vanished. Looking around the current debate near the map crate, you suspect confident people have historically enjoyed disagreeing outdoors in terrible weather. By midday, the scouts decide to search farther west for visible signs of the buried trail. You watch them prepare carefully. Heavy coats, rifles slung across shoulders, lengths of rope tied between riders in case visibility changes suddenly. One man carries strips of cloth for marking the return route back to camp. That detail unsettles you more than expected. Marking the way home means even nearby distances have become uncertain. The riders move slowly into the snowfields beyond camp, horses crunching through drifts beneath pale winter sunlight. Everyone watches until they shrink into tiny dark figures against the endless white plains. And then the waiting begins. Waiting becomes one of the Oregon Trail's least celebrated skills. You help Martha repair torn canvas near the supply wagons while the camp settles uneasily into afternoon routine. The fabric feels stiff beneath your fingers, edges crusted with ice from repeated storms. Nearby, two boys attempt building another snow figure beside the oxen pens. This one apparently represents the trail itself because it immediately collapses and disappears. Honestly, rather accurate. A lesser-known frontier anecdote tells of emigrants naming difficult stretches of trail after current frustrations. Wagons became widow-makers, muddy crossings became ox-killers, and confusing routes earned names unsuitable for polite company. Human beings apparently cope with danger partly through aggressive sarcasm. The sky grows brighter briefly during afternoon hours. Sunlight flashes sharply across the snowfields, almost painfully bright after so many grey storm days. You climb atop a cleared wagon tongue, shading your eyes while staring westward again. Nothing moves out there. No roads, no fences, no smoke. Only smooth white land rolling endlessly toward invisible mountains. The scale of it feels overwhelming. Modern roads condition people to expect certainty. Signs, directions, clear paths. But out here the continent still feels unfinished somehow. Vast spaces where storms can erase human movement overnight without effort. You suddenly understand why emigrants wrote so often about loneliness on the plains. Late afternoon finally brings movement. The scouts return slowly from the west. The entire camp notices instantly. People emerge from wagons. Conversations stop. Even the children fall quieter watching the riders approach through the snow. You study their faces carefully. No excitement, no celebration, just exhaustion and cold. Eli meets them beside the main fire while everyone gathers close enough to hear without appearing too eager. The buried trail has been found. Probably. That single word hangs heavily in the freezing air. Probably. The scouts located faint wagon ruts west of a low ridge nearly hidden beneath drifts. The route appears passable in places and completely buried in others. Travel may be possible if weather remains calm. If another dangerous frontier word! An established observation from emigrant journals is that uncertainty itself often exhausted travellers more deeply than physical hardship. Delays, changing weather, and unclear routes forced constant, difficult decisions with limited information. The West rewarded persistence. It did not guarantee clarity. As evening settles across camp, the mood shifts subtly. Not relief exactly, but direction. People begin discussing preparations again. Harness repairs, wheel checks, how soon the oxen might pull through deeper snow. The buried trail exists somewhere ahead, hidden but not gone. You stand beside the fading firelight watching darkness spread slowly across the frozen prairie. Beyond the camp, the invisible road still waits beneath the drifts leading westward through snow, uncertainty, and distance. And soon, the wagons may have to follow it once more. The debate begins beside the largest fire shortly after sunrise. Nobody announces it formally. People simply gather, one by one at first, then in clusters, boots crunching through packed snow while coffee cups steam into the freezing air. Men pull gloves tighter. Women stand listening from wagon steps with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Even the older children drift closer, sensing something important unfolding. The question waiting over the fire feels simple. Do you move forward or stay where you are? The prairie beyond camp lies silent beneath pale morning light. Snow stretches westward in long glittering drifts interrupted only by distant ridges and the faint uncertain path the scouts discovered yesterday. The buried trail exists. Probably, whether the wagon train should risk following it becomes another matter entirely. You stand near the edge of the gathering while Ely studies the horizon with narrowed eyes. The wind remains calm today. That alone feels suspicious. Winter on the plains rarely grants kindness without eventually requesting repayment. A firmly documented aspect of Oregon Trail travel is that emigrant companies often made decisions collectively during difficult situations, especially when weather threatened survival. Trail captains held authority, but families frequently debated route choices, river crossings, camp timing, and whether to push forward or delay travel, which means frontier democracy occasionally occurred while everyone froze beside oxen. One man argues for leaving immediately. Every extra day trapped here consumes food and livestock feed. The trail ahead may worsen with the next storm. Waiting too long risks becoming fully stranded deeper into winter. Another man shakes his head. The snow remains too deep. Wagons could break axles. Animals already show exhaustion. If another blizzard arrives while moving, the train may scatter across the plains. Nobody raises their voice. That somehow makes the tension heavier. People speak carefully because every argument contains truth. Martha stands beside the fire holding her coffee cup with both hands. What happens if we stay another week? She asks quietly. Nobody answers right away, because everyone already understands the mathematics. Less flour, less fuel, weaker animals, colder nights. A peculiar frontier saying appears in several emigrant journals. The trail eats time. Travelers use the phrase to describe how delays consume supplies faster than expected. Broken wagons, storms, illness, and river crossings constantly stole precious days from carefully planned schedules. The trail also appears deeply committed to eating optimism whenever available. You glance around the camp while the discussion continues. Snow still curls around the wagon wheels despite days of digging. Fires burn low to conserve fuel. Blankets hang stiff beside the wagons where yesterday's sunlight failed to dry them fully. The entire camp looks tired, not defeated, just worn thin around the edges. Nearby, two children build tiny roads through the snow using sticks and mittened hands. One pushes a carved wooden toy wagon carefully along the path until it tips sideways into a drift. Even the children apparently understand current transportation difficulties. The debate stretches through the morning. Some want to leave tomorrow. Others insist waiting for warmer weather. One older traveller quietly suggests splitting the wagon train into smaller groups, an idea rejected almost immediately because separating during winter conditions feels dangerously close to volunteering for disaster. Several emigrant accounts confirm that divided wagon companies faced greater risks during severe weather. Larger groups shared labour, supplies, and animal support more effectively, especially when snow or illness slowed progress. Strength in numbers becomes less philosophical once you start digging wagons out of drifts together. You notice nobody discusses Oregon itself anymore. Not the valleys, not farmland, not new homes waiting somewhere beyond the mountains. The conversation has narrowed entirely towards survival. Can the animals pull through deep snow? Will the creek crossings freeze solid enough to support wagon weight? How many days of feed remain? How quickly can camp break apart and move if another storm forms? Fear changes the scale of human thinking. A continuing scholarly discussion examines whether emigrants became more cautious or more reckless after prolonged hardship on the trail. Some diaries suggest exhaustion led travelers toward risky decisions simply to escape delay. Others reveal increasing caution after witnessing storms, illness, or animal losses firsthand. Human beings apparently respond to danger by becoming either extremely careful or deeply unreasonable, occasionally both before lunch. By midday, the camp settles into uneasy waiting while the leadership group walks farther west to inspect the buried route again. You help Eli repair a wagon tongue cracked during the storms while conversations ripple quietly through camp. Nobody works casually today. Every movement carries the feeling of preparation. Women repack crates more securely. Men inspect wheel rims and harness buckles. Children gather scattered firewood before another snowfall can bury it again. Even the oxen seem aware something is changing. They stand alert beside the feed lines, watching the activity with slow, patient eyes. A fascinating but lesser discussed trail custom involved emigrants assigning children small but meaningful jobs during difficult crossings. Carrying kindling, gathering loose equipment, watching younger siblings, or helping with livestock gave children purpose during long, stressful delays. And honestly, children trusted with responsibility usually become far less likely to throw snow directly at each other's faces during serious meetings. Usually, the Western inspection party returns late in the afternoon. Snow squeaks sharply beneath the boots as everyone gathers once more near the main fire. The decision comes quietly. The wagon train will stay. For now, 2 more days at minimum. The buried trail remains too uncertain in several low areas where drifts could trap wheels completely. Another clear day may reveal more landmarks and strengthen the snow surface enough for safer travel. Relief moves through some faces, frustration through others, but no one openly objects, because deep down, most people already suspected this outcome. The older man recovering from illness exhales visibly beside the fire as though the extra rest may save him. Meanwhile, one younger traveller kicks at the snow hard enough to startle a nearby mule. Different people fear different things. Night settles slowly over the prairie afterward. The mood around camp changes again, softer somehow after the decision finally arrives. Fires brighten. Supper cooks in iron kettles. Someone tunes a fiddle near the centre wagons while children chase each other through narrow snowpaths despite repeated warnings regarding boots, scarves, and basic survival instincts. You sit beside the fire holding a cup of coffee gone lukewarm in the cold air. Above the camp, stars appear sharp and brilliant across the winter sky. The buried trail still waits somewhere beyond the darkness. The west remains distant, but tonight the wagons stay together beside the frozen creek, while snow glows pale beneath lantern light, and exhausted families prepare for another quiet night stranded between movement and survival. After enough days trapped by snow, the camp begins developing habits. Not official schedules, nothing written down, just quiet rhythms repeated often enough that everyone starts expecting them. You wake before dawn because someone always wakes before dawn now. Fires must be rebuilt, water melted, animals checked, coffee started before the cold settles too deeply into people's bones. The prairie outside the wagon still lies silent beneath snow and pale stars when you crawl from the blankets. Your boots feel only slightly less frozen than yesterday. Progress comes in very small measurements out here. The fire line already glows faintly ahead through the darkness. Eli crouches beside the coals, feeding thin strips of wood into the flames, while Martha hangs a kettle over the growing heat. Neither speaks at first. Conversation before coffee apparently remains illegal throughout the frontier. You stand quietly beside them, watching sparks drift upward into the pre-dawn sky. The air smells familiar now. Smoke, snow, animal breath, boiling coffee, wet wool drying too slowly near the flames. The scent no longer feels strange. It smells like survival. A commonly overlooked aspect of Oregon Trail life is how quickly emigrants adapted to repetitive routines during difficult stretches. Diaries often describe days structured almost entirely around chores such as gathering fuel, preparing meals, repairing equipment, and caring for livestock. Routine became stability when the landscape offered none. The sky slowly lightens from black to deep blue behind the snowy plains. One by one, more figures emerge from the wagons wrapped in blankets and coats. Children stumble sleepily toward the fire, carrying tin cups nearly too large for their hands. No one rushes anymore. The camp has learned winter pace. You help carry buckets toward the frozen creek where several men chop through thickening ice each morning. The sound echoes sharply across the still prairie. Crack, lift, crack again. Beneath the ice, black water moves slowly through the frozen earth. A strange trail superstition recorded in multiple journals claimed flowing water sounded louder during severe cold. Some emigrants believed hearing the creek clearly at night meant storms were approaching. Whether true or not, the idea certainly sounds dramatic enough for frontier storytelling. Back at camp, breakfast unfolds with practiced efficiency. Cornmeal cooked over low flames, coffee rationed carefully, beans reheated from the previous evening because nobody intends wasting precious fuel preparing entirely new meals every morning. Children eat first whenever possible, then adults. The older man recovering from illness receives extra broth without discussion. Nobody announces these choices aloud. The camp simply adjusts around need. A continuing historical discussion examines how mutual aid functioned inside wagon companies during crises. Some records portray highly cooperative communities sharing labor and supplies freely. Others reveal tensions beneath the surface, especially when resources grew scarce. Yet in moments like this, beside the fire watching broth quietly pass toward the weakest traveller, cooperation feels less ideological and more instinctive. After breakfast, the camp spreads outward into its daily work. You almost know the pattern by heart now. Men clearing snow from wagon wheels before it hardens again overnight. Women mending clothing beside fires where enough light reaches torn fabric. Children carrying kindling, feeding animals, or chasing each other briefly through drifts before adults redirect their energy toward more practical goals. Even the oxen participate in the routine, waiting patiently at feeding time with the solemn expressions of creatures deeply skeptical about human leadership. You spend most of the morning helping repair a damaged wagon cover ripped during the storm. The canvas feels stiff beneath your fingers while Martha threads heavy needles through torn sections with astonishing speed. How many times have you done this, you ask? She shrugs. Enough. That answer somehow contains the entire frontier experience. An established historical observation from emigrant diaries is that constant repair work defined trail life. Wagon covers tore, boots split, wheels cracked, harnesses frayed. Travellers carried sewing kits, spare leather, tools, and grease because equipment failure on isolated stretches of trail could become disastrous. The American West was apparently held together partly through stitching. By midday, sunlight spills briefly across the camp. People react instantly. Blankets spread wider for drying. Children remove mittens despite immediate warnings. One woman washes clothing in heated water beside the creek while muttering about civilized laundries, with enough emotion to qualify as poetry. You sit atop a supply crate eating a small lunch of beans and cold biscuit while listening to the camp around you. Hammering, soft conversation. Animal sounds drifting across the snow. The repetitive scrape of shovels clearing fresh drifts before they deepen. Life continuing in careful circles. Some historians suggest that establishing predictable routines during difficult crossings helped emigrants preserve a sense of normalcy despite extreme conditions. Others argue routine primarily existed because survival labour simply never stopped long enough for reflection. Possibly both explanations can share the same fire. A curious detail preserved in one emigrant account describes children creating school during weather delays. Older siblings practiced reading lessons with younger ones using Bible pages, guidebooks, or letters from home. Even stranded in snow, 19th century parents apparently remained deeply committed to educational accountability. Afternoon drifts onward peacefully for the first time in days. No storm, no urgent meetings, only the steady rhythm of camp life repeating itself across the frozen prairie. You help Eli grease wagon axles while he explains how cold weather changes the wood. Everything shrinks, he says, tightening a metal fitting carefully, it then cracks if you're careless. You glance around the camp. The statement feels broader than wagon maintenance somehow. As evening approaches, familiar patterns return again. Fires rebuilt, soup simmering, children gathered beneath blankets beside the lanterns. Coffee heated slowly while snow begins falling lightly once more beyond the wagons. Not another storm, just quiet drifting flakes settling across the prairie in soft silence. The camp no longer reacts nervously to every snowfall now. People have adapted. Not comfortably, never comfortably, but steadily. You sit beside the fire watching sparks rise into the darkening sky while voices murmur softly around you. Someone tells a story near the livestock pens. Someone laughs. A baby cries briefly before settling again beneath quilts. The routines continue because they must. Morning fires, snow clearing, meals, repairs, animal care. Lanterns glowing behind canvas walls, tiny repeated acts holding the camp together while winter stretches endlessly around them. And out beyond the drifting snow, the buried trail still waits patiently for travellers who have learned how to survive standing still. Children adapt to the snow faster than anyone else. Adults measure storms by danger. Children measure them by whether the drifts are tall enough to jump into. You notice it one pale morning while carrying firewood across camp. The prairie remains buried beneath weeks of snow, the trail still faint and uncertain beyond the western ridge. Yet laughter rises suddenly from behind the wagon line with such unexpected brightness that you stop walking entirely. 3 boys tumble down a packed snowbank beside the livestock pens using broken crate boards as sleds. One crashes directly into a drift deep enough to swallow him to the shoulders. He emerges triumphant. Naturally. Meanwhile, his mother nearly collapses from terror 15 feet away. A broadly accepted historical reality is that emigrant children on the Oregon Trail often contributed meaningful labor despite their age. They gathered fuel, watched younger siblings, carried water, herded animals, and assisted with camp chores daily. Yet diaries also reveal frequent moments of play and imagination, even during difficult crossings. Children remain committed to being children under almost all historical circumstances. You continue toward the fireline smiling despite yourself. The camp feels different this morning. Not easier exactly, but lighter. Several days without major storms have changed the mood. Fires burn stronger beneath calmer skies. More wagon covers stand open during daylight hours. Blankets dry in pale sunlight while people move through camp with slightly less urgency. Even the coughing has softened. The little girl who spent days feverish now sits wrapped in quilts beside Martha, learning card games involving astonishingly serious expressions and highly questionable rules. You suspect Martha invented half the game specifically to keep the child entertained. Honestly excellent leadership. At breakfast, children gather closest to the fire despite repeated reminders about sparks, boots, and basic survival awareness. One boy attempts roasting a bean directly on a stick for reasons no adult fully understands. It explodes into the snow almost immediately. Science advances through sacrifice, a fascinating but lesser discussed frontier habit. Involved emigrant children collecting unusual objects along the trail such as feathers, stones, animal bones, and bits of broken wagon hardware. Some families later preserved these tiny collections as keepsakes from the journey west, which means somewhere in America, A very proud child once presented a bent wagon nail as treasured frontier archaeology. After breakfast, camp chores resume as usual. Snow clearing, harness repairs, water hauling, but now children drift constantly through the work like restless winter birds. They carry kindling in crooked armfuls, chase each other between wagon rows, build forts beside the oxen pens until adults redirect them away from livestock with varying levels of patience. You help Eli inspect wheel rims near the supply wagons, while nearby two girls construct an elaborate tiny village from packed snow and sticks. One snow house apparently represents a bakery, another represents a church, the third, according to overheard conversation, represents where people go when they get tired of beans. Fair enough. Some scholars examining frontier family life suggest children may have adapted psychologically to trail hardships faster than adults, because the journey itself already felt unfamiliar and adventurous to them. Adults carried heavier emotional burdens involving lost homes, uncertain futures, and practical survival concerns. Children simply saw snow tall enough for climbing. Not always, of course. Not every child laughed through the winter. You notice quieter moments too. A little boy staring eastward beyond camp while holding a broken toy wagon wheel. A girl crying softly one evening from homesickness, before her older sister distracts her with stories beside the lantern. Fear still exists here. Children simply weave around it differently. An unusual emigrant story preserved in later recollections describes children creating mock wagon trains from sticks and scraps during long weather delays. They copied adult conversations about rivers, mountains, and difficult crossings while arguing dramatically over imaginary oxen. Apparently even pretend frontier travel required logistical disagreements. By midday, the sunlight strengthens enough to soften the top layer of snow. Camp pathways turn uneven and slippery beneath boots. Children immediately exploit this development by inventing sliding games along packed drifts beside the creek. Adults pretend disapproval while secretly watching with relief. Laughter changes a camp. You realize that now. The sound lifts something invisible from people's shoulders. You sit beside the fire sharing coffee with Martha, while nearby children organize a snowball battle of astonishing strategic intensity. They'll sleep well tonight, she says. One snowball immediately strikes Eli in the back. He turns slowly with the expression of a man considering whether frontier justice applies to minors. The children scatter instantly. Survival instincts remain excellent. A historical point supported by numerous trail diaries is that families often depended on emotional resilience as much as physical endurance during migration. Humor, storytelling, games, and shared routines helped relieve tension during periods of illness, storms, and exhaustion, which means civilization survives partly because somebody eventually throws snow at the wrong adult. The afternoon passes peacefully. Women mend clothing near fires while children practice letters scratched into snow using sticks. One older boy reads aloud haltingly from a weather-stained Bible, while younger children correct him with brutal confidence whenever he stumbles over words. Education on the frontier appears highly collaborative and slightly hostile. You carry extra blankets toward one wagon and pause hearing music drift softly through camp. A fiddle, slow and uneven but warm. Several children gather nearby listening with complete attention, while snow falls lightly beyond the lantern glow. One little girl sways gently in oversized boots while holding her sister's mittened hand. For a moment the camp no longer feels stranded, just temporary. A small human world surviving together in the snow. Some historians continue discussing how frontier childhood differed emotionally from modern assumptions. Older interpretations often portrayed pioneer children as miniature adults burdened entirely by labor. More recent research suggests many children experienced a blend of responsibility, play, fear, curiosity, and adaptation, much like children anywhere else, only with more oxen involved. Evening settles gradually across the prairie. Fires brighten. Supper cooks slowly in iron kettles. Children return reluctantly to wagons after final snow games beneath the darkening sky. You watch them disappear beneath canvas covers, carrying scraps of laughter indoors with them. The wind moves softly across the buried trail beyond camp. Snow drifts quietly through lantern light. And somewhere inside the stranded wagon train, tired children fall asleep dreaming not of danger or distance, but of snow forts, roasted beans, and tomorrow's chance to play again beside the frozen prairie. The first borrowed shovel seems unimportant. You barely notice it. One man lends it across camp after breakfast because another family's shovel handle cracked in the cold overnight. The exchange lasts only seconds before both return to work clearing snow around the wagon line. Then someone shares extra coffee with a sick traveller. Someone else repairs a child's torn mitten beside the fire. By afternoon, Martha sends half a kettle of broth toward a wagon where the mother has barely slept in 2 nights caring for her feverish son. None of these acts appear dramatic. That is precisely why they matter. The camp survives because people stop thinking entirely in terms of mine and yours. Snow changes arithmetic. You wake early beneath the wagon quilts, listening to faint voices outside before dawn. The fireline already glows softly through the darkness, while boots crunch over packed snow between the wagons. Camp life has become deeply interconnected now. If one fire fails, nearby families help rebuild it. If one animal escapes, everyone joins the search. If one wagon axle cracks, 3 men arrive carrying tools before breakfast finishes cooking. The frontier rarely rewards isolated stubbornness for long. A widely acknowledged feature of wagon train travel is that emigrant groups often relied heavily on communal labour during emergencies. Families shared tools, medical knowledge, food preparation, animal care, and repair work because individual survival depended upon broader group stability, especially during winter delays. Cooperation became practical necessity rather than moral decoration. You step outside wrapped in blankets, while pale dawn light spreads slowly across the snowy prairie. Smoke drifts low above camp, carrying familiar scents of coffee and wood smoke into the freezing air. Near the main fire, Eli helps another traveller patch a wagon wheel using strips of heated iron and rawhide bindings. "You owe me coffee for this," Eli mutters. The other man nods seriously. Coffee apparently functions as both beverage and frontier currency. A peculiar emigrant anecdote preserved in later recollections describes wagon travellers informally adopting lonely or struggling individuals during difficult stretches of trail. Widows, elderly travellers, and unmarried young men often became absorbed into broader camp routines through shared meals and labour. Human beings build temporary families remarkably quickly once surrounded by snow and uncertainty. You carry water toward the livestock pens while the camp wakes fully around you. Children haul kindling beside adults. Women shake frost from blankets. Men inspect harnesses and wheel rims before another day of waiting. The routines remain familiar now, but something subtle has changed beneath them. People move around one another more easily, without discussion, without needing instruction. You notice it clearly near midday when one wagon cover tears loose suddenly beneath a sharp gust of wind. Before the family even fully reacts, 6 people are already moving. Someone grabs rope, someone climbs the wheel brace, someone pulls frightened children away from the flapping canvas while another secures the supply crates inside. The repair takes perhaps 10 minutes. Then everyone quietly returns to their own chores. No speeches, no congratulations, just survival continuing. Some historians examining emigrant society argue that hardship on the trail strengthens social bonds through constant interdependence. Others note that cooperation often existed alongside tension, resentment, and occasional conflict over labour or supplies. That seems believable too. Communities are complicated even under ideal circumstances. Communities freezing together on the prairie probably become even more interesting. By afternoon, snow begins falling lightly again. Not enough to threaten another blizzard. Just enough to soften the edges of camp beneath drifting white silence. You help Martha distribute hot tea among several wagons while the older man recovering from illness finally walks short distances on his own again. People notice immediately. His slow walk beside the fire line receives more quiet approval than any speech could inspire. Tiny victories carry enormous emotional weight out here. One little girl even claps when he reaches the next wagon without coughing. He bows dramatically in response. Frontier morale improves significantly through theatrical grandfathers. A lesser-known detail from trail journals mentions emigrants organizing informal mutual aid during difficult periods, particularly among women. Shared childcare, nursing assistance, sewing help, and meal preparation often passed quietly between families without formal arrangement, which means much of Western migration depended upon exhausted women handing one another soup. The snow continues drifting gently through afternoon light. You sit beside the fire mending gloves with awkward concentration, while nearby conversations ripple softly across camp. Someone discusses spring planting plans in Oregon, as though fields already wait just beyond the horizon. Someone else argues about whether snow sounds different under moonlight. A child insists the oxen understand English perfectly, but simply choose not to participate in conversations. Honestly, after several weeks here, you are not entirely prepared to dismiss the possibility. Near sunset, a young mother begins crying quietly beside the wagon line. Not loudly, just suddenly. The kind of exhaustion, tears that arrive without warning after too many cold nights and too little sleep. Before you can even process the moment, two women appear beside her carrying blankets and hot tea. Nobody asks unnecessary questions. Nobody turns the scene into spectacle. The women simply sit together beneath the fading winter light while snow drifts softly around them. The camp has learned this too. Some burdens grow lighter only when shared silently. Researchers continue discussing how emotional support functioned within frontier communities where privacy remained limited and hardship constant. Letters and journals suggest many emigrants formed surprisingly intimate temporary relationships during difficult crossings despite differing backgrounds or beliefs. Hardship strips conversation down to essentials: warmth, food, rest, hope, companionship. As darkness settles across the prairie, the camp gathers naturally toward the fires once more. Lanterns glow behind canvas walls. Soup simmers slowly in blackened kettles. Children drowse against parents wrapped in layers of quilts and buffalo robes while snow whispers softly beyond the wagon circle. You sit beside the flames watching sparks rise upward into the freezing night sky. Around you, dozens of tired travelers continue surviving together through small, repeated acts of kindness. Borrowed tools, shared coffee, mended clothing, extra blankets, quiet company beside difficult fires. The buried trail still waits somewhere west beneath the snowfields. But tonight, the stranded wagon train feels less like separate families trapped together by weather and more like one fragile moving village temporarily paused by winter. And that fragile closeness may be the very thing carrying everyone through the cold. The stories begin after supper, almost every night now, not because anyone formally organizes them, but because darkness arrives early. The wind grows colder after sunset, and human beings trapped together beside prairie fires eventually start talking simply to push back against the silence. You sit close to the flames wrapped in blankets while sparks drift upward into the frozen night. Around the fire, faces glow gold against the surrounding snowfields. Children lean sleepily against parents. Coffee steams slowly from battered tin cups. Beyond the firelight, the prairie disappears entirely into darkness. Only the camp remains. A respected historical fact about overland migration is that evenings on the Oregon Trail often revolved around storytelling, music, reading aloud, and conversation once daily labor finally ended. Entertainment options remained limited, so spoken stories became essential forms of comfort, memory, and social connection. And honestly, after weeks trapped by snow, even hearing somebody complain creatively about muddy river crossings begins sounding deeply compelling. Tonight the storyteller is an older traveller named Mr. Bennett. Nobody remembers exactly how he became the unofficial evening narrator, but he possesses two important qualifications: a loud voice and extremely strong opinions about fish. He settles beside the fire, adjusting blankets around his knees while the children gather closer immediately. "Did I ever tell you about the catfish in Missouri?" he asks. Half the camp groans because apparently he has told this story before. The children cheer anyway. The tale grows larger with each retelling. By current measurements, the fish now weighs roughly the same as a wagon axle, and nearly dragged 3 grown men directly into the river before Mr. Bennett heroically intervened. Martha quietly whispers that the fish was probably 6 inches long. You suspect even that estimate may be generous. Still, everyone listens, because the story itself matters less than the telling. An unusual but documented frontier pastime involved travellers competing to tell exaggerated hunting stories during evenings around campfires. Diaries mention tales growing more dramatic over time, especially after difficult weather when humour became emotionally valuable. Apparently, frontier America invented recreational lying as a survival mechanism. The fire crackles softly while snow drifts through darkness beyond the wagon line. One story leads naturally into another. A woman recalls a thunderstorm back in Illinois so fierce it turned chickens blue with fright. Someone else describes crossing a river farther east where a mule escaped, carrying an entire crate of coffee into waist-deep mud. That story receives horrified silence from the adults. Coffee-related trauma remains very real in camp. You notice how carefully people listen when stories turn toward home. Voices soften then. Descriptions slow. Kitchen gardens. Church bells. Summer evenings on wooden porches while lightning bugs drift across warm fields. The memories seem to warm people almost as much as the fire itself. Some scholars examining emigrant journals suggest storytelling helped travellers preserve emotional continuity during migration. By repeating memories aloud, families maintained connections to places and identities left behind, while adapting to uncertain futures. The stories become bridges between east and west, between home and trail. A lesser-known detail from trail diaries describes emigrants reading newspapers months or even years old repeatedly during long stretches of travel. Familiar articles became communal entertainment simply because printed material remained scarce across the plains, which means somewhere on the frontier, a deeply outdated political argument entertained exhausted travellers through an entire snowstorm. Tonight someone produces a weather-stained book of poems from beneath wagon blankets. The pages are warped from dampness and age, still readable. Mostly, a teenage girl reads softly beside the fire while wind brushes faintly across the distant prairie. Her voice trembles slightly at first from shyness, then steadies as the camp grows quiet around her. Even the children listen. The lantern light catches drifting snowflakes moving through the darkness beyond the fire. For a moment, the camp feels almost peaceful. Not stranded, not desperate, just human. Another accepted historical observation from emigrant records is that music travelled constantly across the trail. Fiddles, harmonicas, hymn singing, and folk songs appear repeatedly in first-hand accounts, often described as emotional relief after exhausting days. You hear that relief clearly tonight when a fiddle emerges near the far wagon line. The melody sounds slow and wandering, shaped more by feeling than precision. Several people hum along quietly while children begin drifting towards sleep against bundled coats and blankets. The music moves softly across the frozen camp, over the fires, past the livestock pens, out into the snow-buried darkness beyond the wagons. Mr. Bennett eventually begins another story involving wolves. The wolves become increasingly organised as the tale progresses. By the middle of the story, they apparently possess military strategy and personal vendettas. No one interrupts him. The younger children stare with enormous eyes while Eli mutters that frontier storytellers should be taxed for exaggeration. A continuing historical discussion asks how much folklore and superstition shaped emigrant life during isolated travel. Journals mention ghost stories, weather signs, prophetic dreams, lucky charms, and strange prairie legends shared beside campfires across the trail. Isolation enlarges imagination. especially when surrounded by endless darkness and unfamiliar landscapes. You glance beyond the firelight toward the buried trail. The prairie under moonlight looks almost unreal tonight. Snow glows pale silver beneath the stars while distant drifts resemble frozen waves rolling endlessly westward. No roads visible. No fences. No signs of civilization. Just the tiny camp gathered against the cold. The sight should feel frightening. Instead, it feels strangely calm. Perhaps because the voices continue around you. Laughter. Music. Stories passed carefully from one tired traveller to another. A child asleep against his mother's shoulder murmurs something about giant catfish in his dreams. Mr. Bennett looks deeply satisfied with this outcome. Late into the evening, the stories grow quieter. People begin drifting back toward wagons, one by one beneath the freezing stars. Lanterns disappear behind canvas walls while fires settle lower into glowing coals. You remain beside the warmth a little longer, listening to the last murmured conversations fade into the winter night. The buried trail still waits beneath the snowfields. Tomorrow will bring more uncertainty, more labour, more difficult decisions about moving west. But tonight, for a few peaceful hours beside the lantern glow, the stranded camp has built something softer against the cold. Not just shelter, not just survival, a small shared world held together by memory, music, and stories drifting upward into the dark prairie sky. The repairs begin before sunrise, not because anyone feels ambitious, because movement west may finally become possible soon, and the wagon train has spent too many frozen weeks slowly coming apart around the edges. You step from the wagon into brittle morning air while frost crunches sharply beneath your boots. The prairie lies still beneath pale blue dawn light. Smoke rises in thin, quiet lines from the fire pits while people already move through camp carrying tools, leather straps, wheel grease, and armfuls of damaged equipment. The storm may have paused. Work has not. A well-documented reality of Oregon Trail travel is that wagon maintenance consumed enormous amounts of daily labour. Wheels loosened, axles cracked, canvas tore, harnesses frayed, and metal fittings bent constantly during the long overland journey. The Western migration operated partly through determination and partly through emergency carpentry. You carry a bucket of heated water toward Eli, who kneels beside a wagon wheel inspecting a split section of rim hidden beneath packed snow until yesterday. The wood looks tired. That seems impossible somehow. Yet after months crossing rivers, mud, rock, prairie grass and blizzards, even the wagons appear exhausted. Eli runs rough fingers along the crack. "We catch this now," he says, "or it catches us later." Frontier philosophy often arrives disguised as wagon advice. Nearby, Martha and several others repair clothing beside the fire. Mittens, socks, coat sleeves worn thin from constant labour. Needles flash quickly through wool while children sort buttons and scraps into careful little piles. One small boy proudly announces himself assistant thread inspector. No one fully understands what this position involves. Still, he appears deeply committed. A curious detail from emigrant recollections describes families preserving even tiny scraps of cloth during difficult crossings. Torn garments became patches, worn blankets transformed into mittens or boot liners. Nothing useful was discarded easily once supplies grew limited, which means 19th century frontier fashion often evolved through pure survival instincts. You spend the morning helping repair harness straps damaged by freezing weather. The leather feels stiff and rough beneath your hands despite warming near the fire first. Snow and cold have cracked several buckles completely. Without strong harnesses, the oxen cannot pull. Without the oxen, the wagons remain buried monuments to poor planning. The stakes feel annoyingly high for leather maintenance. Across camp, hammers ring softly against metal fittings while wagon tongues are tightened and wheel hubs greased carefully against future cold. The sound creates a strange music drifting over the snowfields. Tap, scrape, pull, voices murmuring beside the fires. An overlooked but genuine historical detail is that many emigrants carried spare wagon parts precisely because breakdowns were expected rather than unusual. Axles, spokes, bolts, and chains often travelled west packed beneath supplies despite their weight. Apparently, the pioneer mindset involved assuming everything would fail eventually and preparing accordingly. Honestly, and not the worst philosophy. Near midday, the repaired wagon wheel finally slides back into place. Several people step backward admiring it with the quiet satisfaction usually reserved for successful surgery. You notice how proud everyone becomes after fixing even small things now. A repaired boot, a patched coat, a functioning wheel. Each repair feels like reclaiming control from the winter. Some historians studying overland migration suggest constant repair work shaped emigrant psychology more deeply than modern readers realize. Survival depended not upon perfection, but upon endless adaptation. People learned to mend, improvise, rebuild, and continue despite exhaustion. The frontier rewarded persistence over elegance. You walk toward the livestock pens carrying newly repaired reins while snow squeaks beneath your boots. The oxen lift their heads as you approach, broad shapes steaming gently in the cold afternoon air. Even they bear signs of the long delay now. Roughened hides, thinner flanks, harness rubs carefully treated with grease and cloth. The animals need mending too. One lesser-known trail account mentions emigrants braiding horsehair or spare rope fibres into temporary harness repairs when leather supplies ran low. Another describes wagon wheels reinforced with rawhide strips boiled tight around cracked wood. Innovation on the frontier occasionally resembled determined desperation wearing practical boots. The sunlight weakens slowly through the afternoon while camp continues rebuilding itself piece by piece. Children collect dropped nails from the snow. Women air blankets and patch quilt seams beside the fires. Men test wheel movement through cleared pathways between the wagons. Even the older man recovering from illness sits outside carefully sharpening tools beneath a blanket across his knees. Everyone wants usefulness again. That matters more than people admit. A continuing academic discussion examines how labour contributed to emotional resilience during frontier hardship. Some researchers argue practical work reduced anxiety by giving emigrants immediate achievable goals during uncertain conditions. Fixing a wheel will not end winter, but it will fix the wheel. Sometimes that is enough for one day. As evening approaches, the camp looks subtly transformed. Not cleaner exactly. Still muddy beneath the snow in places. Still cluttered with crates, ropes, tools, and half-repaired equipment, but stronger somehow. Prepared. You help Eli test a repaired wagon axle by shifting weight carefully across the frame. The wood groans softly, then settles solid beneath the strain. He nods once. Good enough. That phrase appears to govern most frontier engineering. Supper cooks slowly over the fire pits while repaired harnesses hang drying nearby like strange leather decorations against the fading sky. The smell of soup drifts warmly through camp mixed with smoke, grease, and cold evening air. You sit beside the fire, flexing sore fingers while watching people move between the wagons. Mended coats, repaired boots, patched canvas, greased wheels waiting beneath the snow. The wagon train has spent weeks trapped by winter, yet somehow the camp has not simply survived the delay, it has slowly rebuilt itself inside it. Beyond the firelight, the buried trail still waits beneath frozen drift stretching westward into darkness. Soon the wagons may move again, and when they do, every repaired wheel, stitched mitten, tightened harness, and patched blanket will travel with them across the snow. Small acts of mending carrying an entire frozen camp toward whatever waits beyond the winter plains. The scouts leave before sunrise. You hear them preparing long before you see them. Soft voices near the livestock pens, saddles tightening, harness buckles clicking faintly in the cold dark while the rest of camp still sleeps beneath quilts and canvas. The air outside bites immediately when you step from the wagon. Winter has sharpened overnight again. Stars burn hard and bright above the snowfields while pale moonlight stretches across the prairie in silver shadows. Frost sparkles along wagon wheels and frozen rope lines. Even the smoke from the banked fires rises stiffly into the still air. The scouts move quietly between the wagons, carrying rifles, bedrolls, and strips of cloth for marking the route. Today they search farther west, not just for the buried trail, for fuel, for water crossings, for any sign the wagon train can move safely beyond this frozen pause in the journey. A strongly supported historical fact is that wagon trains often relied on scouting parties to evaluate terrain ahead, especially after storms, river flooding, or difficult mountain crossings. Scouts searched for safer routes, grazing land, water sources, and signs of recent travel from other emigrant groups, which means entire migrations occasionally depended on a few exhausted people wandering into snow carrying questionable maps and enormous responsibility. You walk with Eli toward the departing riders while snow crunches sharply beneath your boots. No winter day. That almost feels stranger than the storms. The prairie lies silent beneath the stars, vast and empty beyond the circle of sleeping wagons. One scout ties a strip of red cloth around a nearby brush branch marking the edge of camp. Another checks the small compass hanging inside his coat before mounting carefully. Nobody speaks dramatically. No speeches about courage or destiny. Just practical instructions traded quietly in freezing darkness. Watch the ridge. Check the creek line. Back before dusk if weather turns. The frontier rarely pauses for cinematic dialogue. A remarkable but lesser-known detail from emigrant journals describes scouts sometimes following animal tracks during winter conditions to locate water or easier terrain. Buffalo paths and deer trails occasionally revealed routes through deep snow more manageable for wagons and livestock. Human survival has always involved noticing where smarter animals already went. The riders finally disappear westward beneath fading starlight. Camp remains strangely still afterward. You stand beside the fire, warming stiff fingers while dawn slowly lifts across the snow-covered plains. Somewhere beyond the distant ridges, the scouts now move through untouched drifts searching for answers hidden beneath winter silence, and everyone remaining behind waits. Waiting has become its own form of labour here. Morning unfolds gradually. Coffee brews, fires brighten, children emerge wrapped in blankets looking vaguely offended by another freezing sunrise. The routines continue almost automatically now. Yet an undercurrent of tension follows every conversation today. People keep glancing west. You help Martha melt snow beside the fire while she watches the horizon over the kettle rim. If they find clear ground, we move soon, she says quietly. You nod. Neither of you mentions the other possibility. An enduring historical discussion centers on how emigrants interpreted uncertainty during overland travel. Some diaries reveal strong confidence in divine protection or eventual success. Others show constant anxiety beneath outward determination, especially during weather delays and unfamiliar terrain. Human beings appear remarkably skilled at sounding hopeful while privately imagining disaster. By midday, sunlight spills brightly across the prairie for the first time in many days. The snowfields glitter painfully white beneath the clear sky. Children race through camp chasing shadows while adults spread blankets and clothing across wagon rails to dry thoroughly before movement resumes. You climb a low drift beside the western edge of camp, staring toward the distant hills. Nothing. No movement. Only frozen land rolling endlessly beneath the winter sun. The silence out there feels enormous. A strange frontier belief preserved in several trail recollections claimed snow carried sound differently across the plains. Travellers described hearing distant wagon bells, gunshots, or animal calls from astonishing distances during cold, clear weather. You listen carefully for hoofbeats anyway. Nothing. Just the faint creak of wagon canvas behind you, and the soft shifting of oxen near the feed lines. Afternoon passes slowly. Too slowly. People work, but with distraction now. Harnesses are checked repeatedly, wagons repacked, fires maintained carefully while conversations drift constantly back toward the missing scouts. Even the children notice the mood change. Their games stay closer to camp today. One little girl asks Martha whether snow can swallow roads forever. Martha kneels beside her, adjusting a wool scarf. No, she says gently. Roads remember where they are. The answer sounds comforting enough that you almost believe it yourself. Near sunset, someone finally shouts from the western ridge. Every head turns instantly. Dark figures emerge slowly against the snowfields, riding toward camp beneath the fading gold light. The scouts have returned. People try not to rush forward. They fail completely. Within moments, half the camp gathers near the fire line while the riders dismount stiffly from exhausted horses. Frost covers coats and scarves. One scout rubs his hands hard beside the flames before speaking. They found the trail. Clearly this time, not only the wagon ruts, but stretches where earlier travellers had already broken paths through the snow before the storm buried them again. The route west remains difficult, but passable with careful movement. More importantly, they found exposed grassland beyond the next ridge where the livestock may finally graze properly again. That news changes everything. You feel it immediately. The entire camp shifts. Not cheering exactly, something deeper. Relief mixed with fear and sudden preparation. Because now the waiting ends. A documented pattern in emigrant accounts shows how quickly wagon camps transformed once movement became possible again. Delays created temporary settlements with routines and stability. Breaking camp meant abandoning that fragile certainty for renewed danger and exhaustion on the trail. Still, nobody wants to stay here forever. Darkness settles while plans spread rapidly through camp. Travel at first light. Light wagons reorganized first. Extra snow cleared from wheel paths tonight. Animals fed heavily before departure. You sit beside the fire afterward, listening to the camp around you. Voices sharper now. More alert. Children excited by the idea of moving again. Adults quieter beneath their preparation. Beyond the firelight, the prairie stretches west beneath the stars where scouts have finally rediscovered the hidden road through the snow. And tomorrow, after weeks trapped between storm and silence, the wagon train will follow it once more into the frozen unknown. The wagon train moves at dawn. Not quickly. Nothing about this morning feels quick anymore. You wake before first light to the sound of harness chains clinking softly through the frozen dark. Fires glow low beneath iron kettles while people move through camp carrying blankets, crates, and armfuls of equipment packed carefully against the wagons once more. After weeks stranded beside the frozen creek, the camp is becoming a trail again. The realization feels strange, almost unsettling. You step into the bitter morning air while stars still hang above the snowfields. Frost crackles beneath every bootstep. Oxen breathe steaming clouds into the darkness while men tighten harness straps with stiff red hands. Nobody speaks loudly. The camp carries the tense quiet of people preparing for something difficult. A well-established fact of winter travel on the Oregon Trail is that deep snow slowed wagon movement dramatically. Emigrant parties often advanced only a few miles per day under severe conditions, especially when breaking paths through drifts or crossing frozen terrain, which means westward expansion occasionally resembled exhausted civilians dragging furniture through an icebox. You help Eli secure the final supply crates beneath the wagon canvas, while Martha distributes small pieces of biscuit and hot coffee to anyone too busy to stop for proper breakfast. The coffee tastes smoky and thin, still perfect. Nearby, children huddle beneath blankets atop wagon seats, watching the preparations with enormous eyes. One little boy asks whether the trail stayed where they left it. Honestly, everyone would like reassurance on that point. As the eastern sky begins turning pale grey, the order finally comes. Move out! The first wagons lurch forward slowly through the snow. Wheel rims groan against packed drifts. Harness bells jingle softly while the oxen lean into their traces with patient immense strength. Snow crunches beneath hooves and boots in steady rhythm. The sound moves through camp like a heartbeat returning. You walk beside the wagon line while dawn spreads across the frozen plains. The old campsite shrinks gradually behind you. The fire pits, the snow walls, The narrow pathways children stomped between wagons, weeks of survival already beginning to look temporary beneath fresh drifting snow. An intriguing detail preserved in several emigrant diaries describes how quickly abandoned camps disappeared on the plains. Wind, snow, rain, and grass often erased signs of human presence within days or weeks, leaving little evidence entire communities had paused there. The frontier possessed a remarkable talent for forgetting people. The wagon train climbed slowly toward the western ridge discovered by the scouts. Progress feels painfully slow at first. Oxen strain heavily through deeper drifts while men shovel packed snow away from stubborn wheels. Children are ordered repeatedly not to climb down from the wagons because hidden holes beneath the snow could break ankles easily. One child immediately asks if that means the prairie contains secret traps. Technically, yes. Excellent for morale. The buried trail begins appearing more clearly beyond the ridgeline. Faint wagon ruts frozen beneath wind-blown snow, broken patches where earlier travellers churned the drifts into rough, uneven tracks before the storms returned. You feel an almost ridiculous surge of relief seeing those shallow marks in the snow. Proof that other humans passed here. Proof that westward still exists. Some historians continue debating how much psychological comfort emigrants drew from visible trail evidence left by earlier wagon trains. Many journals describe deep emotional reactions upon rediscovering tracks after storms or difficult crossings. Isolation becomes less frightening once you realize somebody else survived the same road before you. The morning grows brighter and colder as the wagon train presses onward. Snow reflects sunlight so fiercely your eyes ache from the glare. Breath freezes against scarves and collars almost immediately. Every exposed piece of metal burns painfully cold to the touch. Yet despite the hardship, the camp mood changes noticeably. Movement itself creates energy, purpose. People shout instructions more confidently now. The oxen respond steadily beneath the cracking harness lines. Even the children grow quieter watching the great slow procession carve westward through the frozen plains. A lesser-known frontier account describes emigrants comparing winter wagon travel to crossing the ocean. The endless white landscape, the creaking wagons, and the slow rolling movement across vast empty distances apparently reminded some travellers of ships struggling through heavy seas. Looking around now, you understand exactly what they meant. The snowdrifts resemble frozen waves. By midday, the wagon train reaches the grassland the scouts discovered. The reaction from the animals happens immediately. Oxen lower their heads, eagerly pawing through thinner snow toward dry prairie grass beneath. Horses snort and pull harder against the traces sensing feed at last. The humans react almost as strongly. People laugh. Actual laughter. Not tired firelight humour but genuine relief. A significant historical reality of overland migration is that livestock grazing opportunities often determine travel decisions more than maps or schedules. Healthy animals meant mobility. Weak animals meant disaster. Civilization on the frontier rested heavily upon creatures chewing grass. The wagons halt briefly while the animals feed. You stand beside the trail stamping warmth back into your boots while sunlight stretches across the endless winter plains. Behind you, the abandoned campsite has vanished entirely beyond the ridge. Ahead, the buried trail continues westward through snow and distance. No one knows exactly how many more storms remain. No one knows whether the mountains ahead will allow safe passage before deeper winter arrives. But the wagon train is moving again, and that matters. Afternoon brings a harder travel. Several wagons sink axle deep, crossing drifted low ground near a frozen creek bed. Men and older boys shove shoulder first against the wheels while oxen strain forward beneath shouted commands. Snow sprays everywhere. One man falls directly backward into a drift after the wagon finally lurches free. The children watching from nearby wagons applaud enthusiastically. Frontier dignity continues suffering severe setback. Still, the train advances, slowly, relentlessly, wheel by wheel across the frozen plains. As evening approaches, the wagons circle once more beside a narrow stand of brush near another creek crossing. Fires ignite quickly against the growing dark while exhausted travelers stumble through familiar camp routines beneath the winter sky. Yet tonight everything feels different. The camp no longer belongs to waiting. It belongs to movement again. You stand beside the fire, listening to the distant creak of settling wagons while snow drifts softly across the rediscovered trail. Tomorrow the journey west continues, and after weeks trapped by winter, the sound of wheels moving through snow now feels almost like hope itself. After several days back on the trail, the snowbound weeks begin changing shape inside people's memories, not disappearing, just softening around the edges. You notice it one evening while the wagons circle beside a shallow creek under fading winter light. Fires crackle between the wheels while tired travellers settle onto crates, blankets, and overturned buckets holding cups of coffee close against the cold. Someone mentions the first blizzard. Immediately 3 different versions of the same storm appear. According to one traveller, where the wind blew so hard it pushed an ox sideways. According to another, the drifts rose higher than the wagon covers. According to Mr. Bennett, who remains deeply committed to historical exaggeration, wolves personally escorted the camp through darkness while snow fell like flour from heaven. Nobody corrects him anymore. The stories have already started becoming legend. A recognized historical pattern among Oregon Trail emigrants is that difficult events were often reshaped through retelling. Diaries, letters, and later recollections sometimes emphasize danger, endurance, humor, or spiritual meaning differently depending on when the story was told. Memory edits survival into narrative surprisingly fast. You sit near the fire warming your hands while snow glows pale beyond the wagon circle. The trail west remains difficult but manageable now. Drifts still slow progress. Nights remain bitterly cold. Yet movement itself changes how people think. The camp no longer feels trapped. And once danger begins falling behind you physically, the mind starts organizing it differently. Children remember the snow forts first. Not the fear, not the coughing, just the sleds made from broken crate boards and the giant drifts beside the livestock pens. One little boy insists the buried camp had snow walls taller than houses. You suspect the drifts barely reach the wagon roofs. Still, nobody argues. The story sounds better his way. A fascinating detail from emigrant recollections reveals how many families later transformed harsh trail experiences into proud family history. Storms, breakdowns, illnesses, and river crossings became stories repeated for generations around dinner tables and holidays. Apparently human beings survive hardship partly by eventually telling it with dramatic hand gestures. The wagon train creaks steadily westward through the frozen plains over the following days. The landscape changes slowly now. More exposed grass, less deep snow between the ridges, occasional stretches where wagon wheels strike frozen earth instead of packed drifts. Every improvement lifts spirits quietly. You walk beside Eli one cold afternoon while sunlight flashes across the snowfields. "Funny thing," he says, adjusting the reins. "A month from now, folks will probably miss parts of it." You stare at him in disbelief. The snow, the stopping. He shrugs. People get used to surviving together. That thought stays with you longer than expected. A lesser discussed frontier observation appears in some emigrant writings, where travellers express nostalgia for difficult campsites once the journey moved onward. Shared hardship created intense temporary communities that disappeared quickly once the wagon separated again. Hardship builds closeness. Movement scatters it. Some historians continue debating how emotionally transformative overland migration truly was for ordinary emigrant families. Certain interpretations emphasize trauma and exhaustion, while others highlight adaptation, resilience, and social bonding formed during the journey west. Looking round the moving wagon train now, you suspect all those things can exist together beneath the same blanket. One evening near sunset, the recovered older man walks slowly beside the fireline holding a cup of coffee, while children gather around him demanding stories about the Great Snow Camp. The title alone sounds ridiculous, and strangely important. He tells them about the first blizzard, the buried wagons, the night the fires nearly died. But by the middle of the story, fear has already softened into humour. People laugh, remembering frozen boots, exploding beans, and Eli being struck by snowballs during serious conversations. Even Eli laughs eventually, though with visible reluctance. An authentic aspect of frontier storytelling is that humour frequently emerged from hardship after the danger passed. Diaries contain surprisingly funny descriptions of wagon mishaps, stubborn livestock, failed cooking attempts, and weather disasters once travellers survived them safely. Human beings possess a remarkable talent for converting suffering into anecdotes. The trail grows busier again farther west. You begin encountering traces of other travellers. Old campfire circles beneath the snow, fresh wheel ruts cutting through frozen ground. Once, briefly, another wagon company moving eastward with exhausted animals and faces nearly as weather-worn as your own. The two groups exchange quick news beside the trail. Weather ahead, river conditions, where grass still shows through snow. Then both continue onward in opposite directions beneath the vast winter sky. A firmly grounded historical reality is that information sharing between wagon companies proved essential during Western migration. News about weather, trail conditions, grazing, illness, and river crossings spread through these brief roadside conversations across enormous distances. The frontier operated partly through rumour carried by freezing strangers. At night beside the fires, the snowbound weeks keep returning through conversation. Martha remembers the cinnamon apples. A child remembers sleeping beneath 6 blankets beside the lantern. Someone else recalls the first clear morning after the storm when the entire prairie glittered silver under the sun. No one speaks much about fear directly anymore. Not because it vanished. Because memory has already begun sanding down its sharpest edges. You realise then that the camp surviving those weeks together mattered beyond simple endurance. The stranded wagon train became a shared reference point. A before and after. People who barely knew each other east of the plains now finish one another's stories beside the fires. As evening settles across another moving camp, you stand beyond the wagon circle staring west. The prairie stretches endlessly beneath moonlight and drifting snow. Somewhere ahead still wait mountains, valleys, settlements, and futures no one can fully imagine yet. But behind you now lies something too, not merely buried campsites and frozen trails, shared memory. Weeks trapped by snow on an endless prairie where strangers became neighbours, neighbours became companions, and survival slowly transformed itself into story. The fires crackle softly behind you while the wagons settle into the cold night once more. And already, even before the journey ends, the white weeks are beginning to become legend. The snow begins thinning almost without warning, not disappearing completely, just loosening its grip on the land little by little as the wagon train pushes farther west beneath pale winter skies. Drifts shrink lower along the trail edges. More prairie grass appears between frozen patches. The creak of wagon wheels against snow slowly gives way to the rougher sound of wood and iron crossing hardened earth again. You notice the change most clearly one morning when sunlight strikes the plains ahead, and something unexpected happens. Water drips, tiny drops sliding from wagon rims and leather straps. The sound feels almost shocking after so many silent frozen weeks. Around you, the camp notices too, people lift their heads toward the sunlight instinctively. Children stomp through slush with reckless excitement. Even the oxen seem to pull easier beneath the brightening sky. Winter's not finished, but it has finally started retreating. A firmly grounded historical observation from emigrant records is that late-season travellers often experienced dramatic emotional shifts once weather improved, and movement became easier again. Morale rose quickly when grass reappeared. Rivers thawed slightly, or temperatures softened after prolonged storms. Hope, it turns out, can arrive through melting mud. The wagon train continues westward across rolling plains, where patches of brown grass now interrupt the snowfields. Smoke rises straighter from the fires during calmer evenings. Blankets dry faster beside the wagons. People laugh more often without realizing it. Even the children stop talking about the great snow camp quite as constantly. New distractions appear. Birds returning overhead. Frozen creeks beginning to move beneath thinning ice. The distant outline of mountains no longer hidden completely behind storms. You walk beside the wagon line one quiet afternoon while Eli adjusts the oxen pace near a rocky slope. The prairie stretches enormous around you beneath a sky, finally carrying hints of spring blue instead of endless grey. Behind the train, the wheel tracks carve dark lines through slush and melting snow. Ahead, the trail continues west. Always west. A curious but authentic detail from pioneer recollections describes travellers saving tiny objects from difficult stretches of trail as personal reminders, bits of broken harness, carved toys, scraps of wagon canvas, or unusual stones sometimes travelled all the way into new homes as quiet proof of survival. You suspect half this wagon train now carries memories heavier than objects. Some historians continue examining whether emigrants viewed the Oregon Trail primarily as hardship or opportunity once they finally reached their destinations. Letters written years later often balance pride and exhaustion together in complicated ways. Perhaps difficult journeys resist simple summaries. The wagon train camps early near a shallow river crossing, where ice drifts slowly downstream beneath fading evening light. Fires flicker warmly beside the wagons while the smell of stew drifts into the cooling air. You sit beside the flames listening to familiar voices around you. People discussing land claims, farming, whether the mountains ahead still hold snow, whether apples grow well in Oregon valleys, ordinary future conversations. For the first time in many weeks, the camp speaks more about tomorrow than survival. That alone feels extraordinary. Mr. Bennett begins another story beside the fire, this one involving a bear, a fishing pole, and what sounds suspiciously like extremely poor decision-making. The children lean closer immediately. Naturally, one little girl interrupts halfway through, asking if the snow camp was the hardest part of the whole journey. The question settles softly over the firelight. Mr. Bennett pauses. The flames crackle. Snowmelt drips quietly from a nearby wagon wheel. Then he smiles. Hard enough, he says. No grand speech, no dramatic lesson, just truth spoken gently into the evening air. A notable feature of emigrant writing is how often important experiences were described plainly rather than dramatically. Many diaries recorded storms, illness, deaths, births, and hardship with remarkable simplicity despite their emotional weight. The frontier rarely paused long enough for polished speeches. Night deepens slowly across the prairie. Stars appear one by one overhead while the wagon train settles into familiar rhythms for perhaps the final time in deep winter conditions. Lanterns glow behind canvas covers. Children drift asleep beneath quilts. Oxen shift quietly near the feed lines. You walk a short distance beyond camp before sleeping. The air feels softer tonight. Still cold, but no longer cruel. Behind you, the fires burn warmly against the dark plains while wagon wheels stand ready for another day westward. Ahead, the trail disappears into moonlit distance, and somewhere far beyond the horizon wait farms, towns, orchards, rivers, and lives. These travellers have imagined for months. Yet strangely, you realize part of them may always remain back there too, beside the frozen creek, inside the snowbound camp, within those long white weeks when movement stopped and survival narrowed life into fires, blankets, shared meals, repaired harnesses, children laughing in drifts, and strangers learning how to endure winter together. The prairie keeps no monuments for such places. Snow melts, grass returns, wheel ruts fade, but the people remember, and memory carries farther than wagons ever could. The firelight behind you flickers softly across the darkening snow, while the wind moves gently through the grass now emerging beneath winter's retreat. You breathe slowly. The trail continues west. The camp sleeps, and the long frozen season that once felt endless has finally begun slipping quietly into the past. The night grows calmer. The wheels rest. The stars drift silently overhead. And little by little the prairie releases its hold. The wind down begins softly now. You settle deeper beneath warm blankets while the wagon train fades gently into distance behind your thoughts. The fires burn lower beside the quiet trail. Oxen breathe slowly in the cold night air. Somewhere beyond the fading lantern glow, snow still rests in pale silver patches across the plains, but the hardest storms have already passed. You no longer need to keep watch tonight. The wheels are still. The camp is safe. The voices around the fires have softened into murmurs and sleepy laughter carried gently through the dark. You imagine the endless prairie stretching peacefully beneath the stars, frozen rivers glowing under moonlight, wagon tracks winding westward through fields of melting snow, the faint smell of smoke drifting upward from dying embers, while tired travellers finally rest after long difficult weeks. The children sleep deeply now beneath heavy quilts. The oxen stand quiet beside the wagons. Even the wind has grown kinder, and somewhere far ahead, beyond the mountains and valleys still waiting in darkness, spring slowly prepares itself across the western land. But tonight there is nowhere you must hurry, no storm chasing the wagons, no shouting through blizzards, only the steady comfort of the fire fading lower and lower beside the trail. You listen to the soft creak of wagon wood cooling in the night air, the faint crackle of the last glowing coals, the peaceful silence settling over the prairie at last. And as the stars drift slowly above the sleeping camp, the long winter journey fades gently into quiet memory. Sweet dreams,